For a whole lot of people, 2020 was a really tough year. A lot of good folks lost their job, some lost their minds too, I guess, and we all had trouble getting our hands on the stuff we needed. Well, the same was true for a lot of bad people too, myself included. As a functioning opioid addict at the time of the pandemic, supply chain issues and general anxiety made it much harder than usual to get a clean fix. It also made it way harder for me to make money since the restaurant I worked at was closed for weeks at a time. My stimulus check didn't last long, and then after a few weeks of burning through my emergency fund, I was starting to get a little worried. Not only that, but the number of dealers going temporarily offline for the lockdowns was getting higher and higher, which in turn drove up the price of everything. I needed a money-making scheme and fast, so I tried all kinds of things, including setting up a .onion domain. Now, a .onion domain is basically a website on the dark web. Now, I can hear all you nerds howling, "Actually," already, but that's basically what it is, and to be honest, it was a little more than a joke to start with. Now, I wanted to learn how to set up a tour site anyways, so what I uploaded ended up just being somewhere between a joke and a Hail Mary, and I worked pretty hard on it, and when it went live, I felt pretty damned proud of it. And then plastered at the top of the page was the site's title and concept, Dirty Deeds Done Dirt Cheap, or 5D for short. Now, it was a reference to one of my all-time favorite AC/DC songs, and I figured it was the perfect way to sell a very specific set of services to the people of East Texas and Western Louisiana. Now see, I might have been a scumbag drug addict, but I was also something of an adrenaline junkie too. I wasn't out to walk old ladies' dogs or help people move apartments. I wanted to do something exciting, something to liven up lockdown, so I offered people a chance to get revenge. Whether it was a bitter ex or some a-hole boss, I was offering to pull a mean prank on them for a pre-arranged price. Clients paid half before the job and half after, on pain of their victim finding out exactly who paid for the prank to be pulled. I didn't think it would get much traction. I mean, it's not like it was a surface layer website that'd show up on Google if I paid them a few bucks a month. A person needed a Tor browser to get access to 5D, and normies don't use Tor. But then one day, I checked the site's email address on a total whim and was surprised to find a job request in its inbox. Now, the message was from an anonymous user, as they all were, who said their ex-boyfriend was an abusive a-hole who needed to be taken down a peg. Now, I offered to shove a bunch of sardines into the vent of his car and explained how they'd be stinking to high heaven after just a day or two in the summer heat. Now, she thought that was a good idea, transferred me half that Bitcoin, and then that night, I drove over to the address that I'd been given where I did the dirty deed. Now, I then took photographic evidence and then received the second half of the payment once I'd driven back home. Now, the girl seemed real happy with the end result, and so she was only too happy to pay. And then when I told her to recommend me to a friend, she actually did, and I got my second job just a couple of days later. Those first two jobs were the only ones that I had for like 3 months, but when the second stay-at-home order was issued by Greg Abbott, I guess more and more people decided to screw around on the dark web, but slowly and surely, business started to pick up. Now, I smeared a bunch of dog crap on some guy's front door handle, apparently because he stiffed a client out of overtime pay. I then plastered this lady's house in a bologna mosaic because the acid in cheap bologna etches clear coat in the sun and ruins a paint job. And I was told that she gave a kid a bad grade for some petty personal reason, but I didn't care, as long as the Bitcoin arrived in my wallet. Now, I even rolled a bunch of glitter onto a driveway, and sprayed a bunch of herbicide onto a lawn so it spelled out a curse word, and I once painted a house with pure fish emulsion at night. It seeps into whatever it touches and makes a place smell like low tide mixed with death for like 6 weeks. And as you can tell, I became something of an artist when it came to pulling especially mean pranks. And then with all the photographic evidence that I was uploading to the site, visitors were able to see how serious and effective I was, and that generated a lot of business. Things started fairly light, shall we say, with my mainstay being mean revenge pranks. But then as time went on, the job started to get a little more sinister. And one time a user asked me to take a package from a deserted pickup point to a deserted dead drop, and I knew it was probably drugs or something, maybe a hot pistol wrapped up tight in a t-shirt and taped up. But the price was right, and so the job was done. And I used to get similar or identical jobs maybe once or twice a week too, so those were my big earners for a while. But then came stuff that really started to push my limit. One time I was instructed to pick up a thumb drive from this dead drop, and then I had to take it to some dude over in Kilgore who either put something on it or copied something from it before taking it back to the dead drop. I don't know what the heck was on that thumb drive, and neither do I want to, but from the look of the dude that I dealt with, whatever it was very, very nasty. And that was the first time that I got home from a job and figured that I should probably be a little bit more choosy when it came to the jobs I took. I wasn't even desperate for cash by then either, because the restaurant had opened again and I was getting shifts. Now, I wasn't going to do it for money anymore. I was kind of just doing it for kicks. I did a few more jobs, nothing too sinister, but I was really starting to notice the change in clientele. I was getting fewer and fewer jobs that could be described as harmless pranks, and more that, like those others, made me feel sick to my stomach once they were over and done with. I'd already decided to close this site when that last request came in, but as you'll soon see, I had no choice but to entertain it when I saw how much money they were talking. And so by this stage, I was checking 5D's email only once or twice a week instead of every day. I was mostly just skimming the emails, turning my nose up to all the weirder requests that were most likely way more illegal than just making someone's car smell like anchovies. But then, I saw this one request, one which promised me way more money than I'd ever been paid before. I charged a couple of $100 for more basic jobs, a couple of $1,000 for much more complex or costly ones like the fish one, but this one was offering me $10,000 for a single night's work. Now, I emailed them back, saying if the job involved physically hurting anyone, I wasn't interested, and they replied saying that I wouldn't have to hurt anyone, but that the job might require coercion and possibly some physical force too. But for 10 grand, I was more than willing to get a little handsy with someone if I could guarantee a clean getaway. And only then did I ask what they needed, and only then did they drop the bombshell on me. They wanted me to kidnap someone. Now obviously I had questions, and the first one was, who? Now I wasn't expecting the answer they gave me, and not because of the name they gave me either, very much the opposite. You see, they didn't give me a name. They just told me, anybody. And once they told me the job was to kidnap literally any female, preferably an adult, but a child would do, I was thinking, no way, dude. This is either a prank or a fed. But then they lost me altogether by claiming that they were part of some big, shadowy organization that liked to partake in, of all things, live cannibalism. That's not just regular old cannibalism either, people. Like the kind that kept the Donner Party going. Live cannibalism involves amputating parts of your victim while they're still alive, and then cooking and consuming said parts while the victim is forced to watch. I called the guy out, told him I didn't believe a word of that, and said that he wouldn't be hearing from me again. And this, ladies and gentlemen, is when they sent me their X-Pub. Now, without getting too technical, if you put someone's X-Pub, Y-Pub, or Z-Pub into an extended public address in a blockchain explorer, you see their total crypto balance for any given wallet. It's not a particularly smart thing to show a stranger because you can see this person's transaction history too, not just the amount of crypto they've accrued. But this is how I realized this guy wasn't some bullcrapper, and wasn't some edgy 15-year-old doing it for the lols. The guy had $500,000 worth of Bitcoin, and his transaction history showed evidence of major traffic. He was 100% legit. Bitcoin was moving in and out of that wallet every single day, and some of the transactions were way higher than just 10K. It was probably the strongest evidence this guy could have possibly presented to me to prove that he was legitimate, and so as you can imagine, I was pretty stunned. But I wasn't horrified. Not yet. Just because the guy had a ton of Bitcoin at hand didn't mean it wasn't a prank. But instead of dismissing my concerns, this guy made every effort to address them. They wouldn't give me any details regarding their organization, only that they existed. But on the off chance any of the girls' remains were found and a murder investigation was opened, they also didn't want anyone who'd freak out and go to the cops. They wanted someone who could live with themselves, having sold a human life for just a few $1,000s, and I guess they figured that person was me. But they were wrong. Dead wrong. As I ended up talking to this anonymous and apparently very wealthy user from around 11 at night to 3:30 in the morning, talking methods, techniques, and logistics. They had a drop-off location lined up and claimed that they could guarantee the site's security, but they also offered help in planning the actual kidnap and offered me a bunch of advice on how to coerce, intimidate, and overpower my potential victim. I actually typed out a bunch of it, but it's probably not very YouTube-friendly to be talking about that kind of stuff in videos. Specific stuff, I mean, so I'll just skip over the particulars of what I was told. But needless to say, it was detailed, it was extensive, and it was disturbing, and to me, it was yet more proof that this person was not just some prankster with a dark sense of humor. They were for real. I suppose now's a good time to make it clear that I had no intention whatsoever of actually going through with the job. As in, from the moment the word kidnap appeared on screen, I was out. And then after a certain point, every single question I asked and every piece of information I extracted was purely for the benefit of law enforcement. I didn't even confirm the job with the client, I just confirmed my interest and said that I'd get back to him within 24 hours. But not even 2 hours of those had passed before I had taken 5D offline. I was exhausted afterwards and I desperately needed to get to sleep, but I couldn't, and instead, I headed out to a payphone while it was still dark. I used a text-to-speech program on my phone to relay everything I'd been told to a police dispatcher, including the address of the drop-off point, which I'm assuming was the most useful to them seeing as someone's name had to be tied to the deed. Now, what kept me awake, what pushed me to report what had happened rather than the 8 hours of sleep I needed, was something the anonymous user had said after I told them I wasn't interested. They told me it was 5 figures for one night's work, that it was worth my time and I wouldn't get caught if I only did it right. But once again, I just said not interested. In response, the guy then says, and this isn't verbatim, but I'll summarize, "If you won't do it, we'll find someone who will." Now, this was before I'd seen the guy's Bitcoin wallet, so the words didn't land as intended until after I'd seen it, but once I had, it changed everything. I mean, I still wasn't 100% sure that what had happened was for real, because you can never really be sure of strangers you meet online until you truly know them. But although I was creeped out enough to report it, I wasn't convinced that I'd heard anything about it, as like any sort of arrests or trials or anything of that nature. But then one day, I did. So this was in September, and I was just sort of mindlessly scrolling when I spotted a headline about a guy from Texas. And seeing as it was local news, the headline grabbed my attention right away, but what I read made my jaw drop. A man had just been convicted of soliciting murder and cannibalism on the internet, and his name was Alex Barter. Long story short, Barter ended up talking to an undercover cop online, and from what I read, he gave them pretty much the same speech that I'd been given by the anonymous user. The undercover cop was offered cash to procure a kidnap victim, and just like in my case, the person was open and honest about the fate awaiting the victim. And there was nothing in any of the articles about the Bitcoin wallet that I'd seen, and there was also minor deviations in what the cop appeared to have been told. But while it all sounded very familiar, seeing a picture of Barter was confusing to say the least. If you Google image search this guy's picture, you'll agree that I'm being very generous when I say that he hardly looks like a criminal mastermind. He was only 23 when he was convicted, and he was apparently acting alone. But Barter was first arrested in 2018, and it just took till 2020 to sentence him. So if that was the case, then who the heck had I been talking to if Barter had been acting alone? And that's what makes me think that there really is some kind of network of people out there. Maybe they're not quite the criminal geniuses they like to think they are, but they've got money, and by the looks of things, they've got people too. Maybe they're better described as fall guys or pawns if you're feeling fancy. But they got people out there doing the legwork for them to keep the rich guys' hands from getting dirty. And I think I encountered one of them, and to this day, it scares the crap out of me how people like that exist. There will be more of them too, and just like they told me, it's only a matter of time before they find someone willing to work with them. And that little factoid is something that still keeps me up at night, even all these years later. My name is Max, and I grew up in Germany, and for as long as I have lived, I have tried to live a good life. I obeyed my mother and father, and I worked hard in school and university, and then I ambitiously and meticulously prepared myself for a career at one of Germany's most elite manufacturing companies. I was ambitious, aggressively so, and I can't deny that, but I was never arrogant and always remained ethical and humble in all my dealings with others. I donated a portion of my salary to charity and even a portion of my time to a local deaf charity. And while I admit to doing this to bolster my own self of well-being, that came part and parcel with living a life of good works and community service. But it was still not enough to keep me out of trouble. By the age of 32, in 2010, I hadn't been involved in any sort of violent altercation since a schoolyard shoving match during a game of football. And I lived a simple, happy life, having married in 2008, and by 2010, we had decided to start trying for a baby. It was a happy and exciting period in my life, probably the happiest and most exciting I'd ever known, but it was exhausting too. I'm not trying to make a crude joke, I just simply mean that my wife and I began planning like crazy, picking out design plans and furniture for our upcoming nursery. Now, it was a lot to think about, and I ended up losing more than a few hours of sleep over it. But it wasn't just the prospect of becoming a first-time father that was keeping me up, because I'd also put my name in for a promotion at work. A position had opened up following the resignation of a colleague. It was essentially an assistant director's role for my division of the office, so while I wouldn't be in charge, I'd have dominion over my former coworkers. And almost everyone put their name forward for the role, and I was open with my colleagues about doing the same. Everyone wished each other luck, and I believed everyone had the attitude of let the best man win. But as I came to learn, that was not entirely the case. I remember the day that a colleague in another department gave me the good news. We had all interviewed for the position, but management had not yet decided who the best candidate had been, and so we were all still waiting to hear back from them when an old friend of mine pulled me aside. He was dating one of the bigwig secretaries, this girl named Clara who had access to the executive lounge, and it was there that she had heard a member of management explaining how strongly I'd interviewed and how I'd entered a final pool of just 4 potential candidates. And as you can imagine, this was fantastic news which made me very happy, and I rode that wave of excitement all day long. But when it came time to finish work and head home, I remember feeling the exhaustion starting to get to me. By the time I climbed into my car seat and slid the keys into the ignition, I actually considered napping for a little bit of an hour so I had the energy to drive home, but I decided against it. Then, and only then, did I fasten my seatbelt and check my rear view to see if anyone was behind me. And if I'd chosen to do so any later, I might presently be dead, because when I looked up, occupying one portion of my rear view was a masked man. I believed him to be a car thief or a carjacker, I suppose you might say, so I quickly locked my doors and turned on my engine, intent on driving away. And yet the moment I turned the key, I heard the first shot. My windshield shattered along with the back windows, and I instinctively lowered myself down in my seat. If I hadn't, I'd be dead right now, as a police officer told me one of the bullets traveled directly through the headrest where my skull had just been moments before. I was able to drive quite easily, but I was so panicked that I almost crashed into the adjacent row of cars as I turned out of the parking lot and into the open corridor. I don't know exactly when the gunman stopped shooting. I was too focused on my escape, so I didn't slide up in my seat and resume a regular driving position until I was out on the street again, and fleeing as fast as my car would travel. I'm not sure exactly how long I drove for, but I did so very quickly. It occurred to me that I might get pulled over by the police, but I decided I didn't care. It would save me waiting for them in the parking lot of the fast food restaurant, which is where I ended up calling them from after nearly getting into several accidents while driving. The police officer was there within just a few minutes, and after explaining what had happened to her, she calmly offered me a ride to the police station so I could give a longer and much more detailed statement. My car wasn't roadworthy anymore, so I was given a ride back home where I explained to my very tearful wife that someone had just tried to murder me for no apparent reason whatsoever. It was a terrible time for both of us, but for weeks I believed that I had been almost the victim of a very aggressive carjacker and nothing more. But I was wrong. The police found the man who tried to shoot me, and at first I was amazed. I had a lot of faith in the federal police force, but the speed at which they apprehended the man was impressive nonetheless. Once again, I expected his motive to either be greed or addiction, as in he wanted my vehicle. But while greed was indeed a factor, it was not my vehicle that the man wanted. He wanted my life. And after the police tracked him down and arrested him, the man chose to cooperate in exchange for a more lenient sentence, and what he told the police was truly shocking to me. He'd been hired to kill me after discovering that there was a bounty on my head, and he discovered this on a sort of invisible website accessible to only certain people who knew how to find it. The investigator used the English language term dark web when I spoke to him, but the significance of this was lost on me for quite some time until I heard about other people being targeted in similar contract killings. The man confessed to having been hired by an anonymous source and had no idea why they wanted me dead. But what he did say was that the man who hired him seemed to have a very intimate knowledge of my work schedule along with where I parked my car. And this is how we came to learn that it was probably one of my coworkers that had paid him for my death. But despite everyone in my department being questioned, as well as company executives, no arrests were made and no definitive evidence was ever found. Now, I wasn't surprised. The prognosis had been bleak from the beginning. If someone knew how to hire a hitman on that dark web, even if it was an incompetent one, they most likely had the wherewithal to delete any evidence of the exchange from their computers. And this meant that, even after their digital devices were analyzed, police were no closer to finding the person who tried to have me killed. Naturally, a huge part of me wanted to depart the company and find work elsewhere. I couldn't possibly work alongside anyone I suspected of wanting me dead, and that's what I told the executives. It was a bitter irony to find out that I'd secured a job that I didn't even want anymore. But in the end, I was made an offer I couldn't refuse. Now, I was offered an inflated salary, extra benefits, and I was promised the company parking lot would be reinforced and manned by security from then on. I was also offered a considerable one-time payment as well as legal aid from the company's lawyers to keep the story out of the media, as the executives didn't want any bad press. Now, if I was a single man, I might have refused on principle. But since I was trying to start a family, it was my future wife that made the final decision, and if anything, staying at the company might help me root out the person who tried to have me killed. But I never did figure out who it was. None of the other candidates, including those in the final pool, displayed any observably strange or erratic behaviors in the immediate aftermath, leading some to theorize that the person who hired my potential killer was someone from outside the company who was intent on doing it harm. Now, this remains the most haunting mystery of my entire life, but not purely because I came so close to a violent death. It's because it serves as a reminder that man can do everything right, keep himself spiritually and morally pure, and he can still attract the kind of evil that's been spoken about since man first learned to speak. Hello, Joel. You can call me H. I grew up in London, and when I was a kid, I had a massive interest in computers. Now, my parents did all right for themselves career-wise, meaning that they had enough money to buy a PC when they still ran on Windows 95. And I used to go crazy on MS Paint or play the video games on the floppy disks my dad had brought home from work. And to me, that computer was nothing short of magic. And then as I got older, I got more and more interested in how they worked. And then in the year 2000, Dad signed us up for a Telewest dial-up internet connection, and that changed everything. I became a full-on computer nerd, and possibly at the perfect time to do so. The country was in the final stages of its IT revolution, and a degree in almost anything IT-related meant a ticket to the gravy train. Companies all over the country were practically letting IT graduates name their salaries. Because if you could run their networks and servers and allow them access to e-commerce, you'd make them hundreds of times whatever they spent on you. Now, I landed myself on one such job in 2008, and to say that I'd landed on my feet would be an understatement, but I earned my keep. I was very good at my job, but only because of how deeply it fascinated me, and long before 2008, I'd been reading about something which had passed from scientific theory to urban legend. You might know it as the deep web. Now, the deep web is a very different concept to the dark web, even though the two terms are kind of used interchangeably. The concept of the deep web has been around ever since the internet was invented, as in no different than the concept of public and private property. There's nothing inherently sinister about setting up some private website, but it was also inevitable that certain people would use it for illicit means, and frankly, it's amazing that it took until the late 2000s for that to finally happen. And that's when the term dark web was coined, to describe these sinister sites that traded in highly illegal merchandise and in some cases, even murder. And as you can imagine, the prospect fascinated me. And so off I went looking for them, and that's when I found the Silk Road. It was a fitting name, really, harking back to the 2nd century Pan-Asian trade route which brought spices and fine china to Europe. But this was anything but state-sanctioned. Set up by an American and launched in, I think it was 2011, the Silk Road didn't just sell drugs, it sold everything. But under that everything umbrella was a hell of a lot of drugs, guns, and other contraband like handheld hacking devices, banned media, or Asian-made sweets that were banned from US markets. Now, you could count the list of rules on one hand, and almost everything functioned on an honor-based system, which turned my idea of drug dealing on its head. I'd always just assumed it was all about low purity, stepped-up products, and ripping people off at every turn. But the Silk Road was the polar opposite. It allowed wholesalers, and in some cases even manufacturers, to market their high-purity products at rock-bottom prices, mainly because they were cutting out the oh-so-expensive middlemen, and it was making people a hell of a lot of money. I visited the Silk Road every day for about 2 weeks before my curiosity evolved into something that I know now was greed, but at the time felt like opportunity. I made decent money, and I loved my job, but I was also lacking excitement in my life, and I was still young and stupid enough to really crave it. It also constituted a whole new system for me to obsess over, and by system, I mean the method by which drugs travel from their manufacturers to their consumers. I did enough research on shipping and pricing to ensure that I had at least a cursory knowledge of what I needed to do. And so one day in early 2012, I pulled the trigger on my little plan and ordered half a kilo of heroin for what amounted to 10 grand in cryptocurrency. Silk Road actually had seller reviews and a whole other seller reliability rating, and so I was easily able to find a highly rated heroin dealer who promised to hide my product in a small appliance of some kind before shipping it over. Part of me didn't really believe it would arrive, even though I knew the site was heavily policed in terms of fake reviews and scam sellers. And so when the package arrived, delivered by Royal Mail no less, My heart was thumping as I opened it up and disassembled what turned out to be a computer monitor. Now there it was, packed tightly in clear plastic baggies, half a kilo of pure golden brown Afghan heroin, enough to land me in prison from anywhere from 12 to 16 years. And after that, I had to find a buyer. And while you might assume that that was a relatively difficult process, it was not. I went into town on a Friday night, walked up to the first beggar I saw, and then told him that I'd give him a tenner if he showed me where to buy heroin. And that was all it took. He walked me to a phone, called a phone number after I handed him some change, and then about 15 minutes later, this teenage boy rode up on his bike and this beggar bought a bag of what he called brown from him. And that's when I stepped in and told the young lad on the bike that I wanted to talk to his boss. It was dark out, but I could still see the skeptical look that he gave me. But after a little exposition, he relented and asked for my phone number and then rode off saying that he'd pass it off to his boss. Not even 2 hours had elapsed before I got a call back and was making the half-hour walk to the dark, deserted street that I'd been told to wait on. And this is when I did something crucial and put on a ski mask. I made sure to keep myself out of sight, but that meant when a trio of what looked like hooded teenagers showed up, I almost scared the living daylights out of them when I'd stepped out to greet them. And once we'd confirmed that I was friendly, they told me to show them what I had, and since I had the good mind to bring a very small sample with me, I was only too willing to hand it over. They were still looking at me a bit funny since I was wearing the mask, but one of them, this poorly-looking lad who turned out to be older than the rest, dabbed a bit out onto his fist and then snorted it. I knew the product was pure, and therefore potent, but I wasn't ready for the effect it'd have on the user. It knocked him out on his feet. He couldn't talk, he couldn't keep his head raised, and he just sort of swayed on his feet while the other two boys just held back their laughter. Now they too seemed impressed with what I had, and then, after the old cliched question of, "You're not the police, are you?" they led me to the top floor of a block of flats to what you Americans would call the trap. And this is where I first met Steven. He made a really big deal out of the ski mask, aggressively at first, but then much more jovially as we got talking. He didn't like that I was wearing it, and then suddenly did like that I was wearing it. It made me a character, as he put it. There were more movie cliches when he and his boys had pat me down for a wire, and I was tempted to inform him that audio bugs were so small and reliable that I'd have one hidden in one of the buttons of my jacket, but I didn't. And after that, we got talking. And thanks to the sample, I didn't need to do much of it. The product spoke for itself thanks to the zombified junkie who had to be herded back to the flat. Steven had a lot of questions, and I tried to answer as few of them as possible. I just simply told him that I had a lucrative business opportunity, and we could both get very rich off of it. And as you can imagine, this was music to his ears. He had his own bosses he needed to keep sweet, and the best way of doing that was making more money for them. And all he had to do was work with me, agree to my terms, and I'd get him the quality product that he needed to get an edge on the competition at a price he couldn't find anywhere else. That's how things started. And while things were a little bit shaky at first in terms of handoffs and keeping my identity a secret, I soon found a rhythm. I'd meet Steven's couriers in varied but local locations, ensuring my face was covered in ways that preferably didn't attract attention. A scarf and sunglasses in the wintertime, for example, where I could just pull it up over my face nice and quickly. But whenever I met with Steven face to not face, as it were, I wore the ski mask and sunglasses and never drove over in my car. Half kilos soon became kilos, but the most I ever sold at one time was 2 kilos. The most increasing variable after that was the frequency I would obtain packages. Because while the Silk Road was somewhat reliable, it wasn't foolproof. Not all poppy harvests yield the same quality product, so profit margins varied, and occasionally a trustworthy purveyor of quality goods would simply drop off the map for a while or nuke their account entirely. Delivering the packages to Steven's couriers was also pretty nerve-wracking, and walking around with kilos of heroin on my person never got old. It was always terrifying. Always. But my God, did it make me a lot of money. I was paid in cash, bundles of it too, half of which I deposited in a very dodgy credit union run by two Bangladeshi blokes who took 10% for the privilege of washing my dosh, so to speak. Now the rest I spent on daily essentials, petrol, food shops, takeaways, stuff that doesn't raise any eyebrows when you pay with crisp 50-pound notes. And this went on for more than 2 years. Silk Road was shut down at one point, and its founder was arrested, but a replacement was set up in no time at all, so I was able to continue my dealings with Stephen after only the briefest of interruptions. But then came the day when I was almost caught, or at least that's what it felt like, because the package containing 2 kilos was just feet away from my front door when a police officer called at my flat to ask about a recent spate of burglaries. Now, it was still hidden away in its containers, the cavity of a rice cooker, so even if the officer came in and looked around, they wouldn't have suspected a thing. But paranoia is a hell of a drug, and that marked the first time that I began to consider giving it all up. I'd made a mind-boggling amount of money for such a small amount of overall work. Not quite £1 million, but close enough to feel like it. And once I had everything washed, I had enough to buy a house, enough to fritter away, and enough to squirrel away for the inevitable rainy days. And so I decided to quit while I was ahead. Now, I sold a few more packages to Stephen, even to put together some money to celebrate with once I'd made a clean break from the business. And then one day, I gave him a call to let him know that I was getting out. And I suppose it shows how utterly naive I still was that I thought that he'd be happy for me. We weren't friends, but we were fairly close. You can't not be if you're making so much money together. I think he wouldn't be over the moon about losing such a valuable asset, but I didn't think he'd get angry, and I certainly didn't think that he'd start threatening me. It turns out he did both. I called him, told him I was getting out, and at first, I could tell that he was nonplussed because of how quiet he went. Stephen was a talker, probably not the most ideal trait in a drug dealer, but that was just his way. So as I explained my plan to get out, and I didn't hear so much as a or an okay, I knew that he wasn't taking it well. But things got so much worse. Stephen was not accepting my resignation, and in a strange parody of a legitimate business, insisted I work a notice period before finally departing. Now, I offered to teach him about crypto and how to use the Silk Road, but Stephen was having none of it. He told me he had no obligations to people, and that he couldn't downsize without first getting the right liquidity. Stephen would often incorrectly use business terms that he didn't understand, but his point was clear. Without me, he wouldn't make as much money, and he didn't fancy that one bit. Now, before long, Stephen was straight up threatening me. Myself, my family, my friends, anything that sprang to mind. But if there's one thing that I stayed consistent with, it was keeping my identity a secret to the point that my only identifying features were the clothes that I wore to meetings, which were outfits that I never wore anywhere else, and my voice. So unless Stephen had some piece of miracle technology which would hunt me down using the sound of my voice alone, he wouldn't know where to find me. And so with that in mind, I did what very few people have done throughout history, and I hung up on an angry gangster. I'm not going to pretend that I was Mr. Cool about it. It made for a terrifying experience, and once my nerves had settled and I could think clear and straight again, I realized that I had absolutely nothing to be afraid of. Me and Stephen didn't mix in the same circles, we didn't live in the same areas of the city, and I'd never seen him during daylight hours either, so I'm pretty sure that we even kept different sleep schedules. I wasn't worried about bumping into him or any of his other little cronies anywhere, and even if I did, all I had to do was keep my mouth shut and they wouldn't realize it was me. As far as I knew, I'd gotten away with illegally making hundreds of thousands of pounds completely scot-free. And bloody hell, did that feel good. After 6 months or so of lying low and not spending too much, in which time the Silk Road got shut down for good, I decided to make my very first luxury purchase from a Bentley dealership. It was a used Bentley, so considerably less expensive than a brand new one, but Bentley's pre-owned program is probably the best on the market, so you end up with a car that is as next to brand new as it's possible to get. I visited the dealership once or twice before, mostly just driving past to admire the display models. But once I was in the clear money-wise, I started talking to the salespeople to get an idea of pricing and availability. It took a couple of visits to nail down the model I wanted. The salesman saw a chance to flog something a bit more expensive to someone young and flashy, but I was after something a little more discreet. Those sorts of models tended not to be entered into the pre-owned system, so I had to wait about 6 weeks before one became available. But when one did, I zoomed over to the dealership and put down the deposit that secured the car as mine. It felt like a victory parade, and I was happy as a pig in crap as I sat with the salesman signing papers and swapping cheerful banter. The whole process lasted about 45 minutes, and in that time, the dealership was visited by 2 men who wandered around the display models and then spoke with a saleswoman. I didn't pay any attention to them. I was far too focused on feeling smug and ogling the pictures of my refurbished Bentley. And then when the final papers were signed and I was given a date to pick up the car, I shook the salesman's hand, thanked him for all his time, and then rose from my chair and headed for the showroom's exit. But as I did, I noticed one of the 2 men looking at me. But not just looking, staring while standing statue still about 10 feet away. Maybe it's having grown up in London, but I didn't immediately return the man's stare. I just thought, what the hell are you looking at, while trying not to provoke a confrontation. That might sound a bit extreme to some of you, but as I said, London might be one of the oldest cities in the world, but it's not the friendliest. That meant that it wasn't until I was within feet of the door that I shot the man a look, and when I did, my blood turned to ice. It was not some random toff stopping in to buy a brand new Bentley. In fact, it was the one person in the world that I didn't want it to be. It was Stephen. He was wearing a suit and tie, which is partly why he didn't grab my attention when I saw him in my peripheral vision, and he was staring at me like I'd just grown a second head. Now, I was right about to say something like, "Can I help you?" but I cut myself off and tried my very best to keep a neutral look on my face as I turned it away from him. But no sooner had I done that, he asked me, "Do I know you?" Stephen had been listening to me speak to the salesman for about 15 to 20 minutes, so I'm amazed that he hadn't had the realization earlier. But I knew what a precarious position I was in there, so I just stared back at him and simply shook my head before continuing on my way. My heart felt like it was trying to burst out of my chest by the time I was out the doors, and I had to summon every ounce of bravery I had not to sprint to my car and drive off doing 100. But as I started my engine and drove out of the dealership, I saw Stephen standing just outside the doors with his phone in his hand, quite clearly taking pictures or video as I was driving off. And as I drove, it felt like my heart was going into palpitations or I was having a panic attack or something. My vision started getting very gray around the edges, and I was taking shallower and shallower breaths. As much as I was scared I might crash my car, I knew I couldn't stop, because Stephen might just be a few cars behind me. I didn't drive home. I was going to, but then realized how stupid that was given what had just happened, and turned to drive in the opposite direction. I ended up clocking maybe 5 or 6 miles before I turned into the car park of an apartment building and turned off my engine. That was the first real chance I had to stop and think, which felt like a relief at first because at least I wasn't going to lose concentration and crash my car. But it turned out to be anything but, because stopping only allowed the crushing reality of the situation to set in. Stephen had recognized me. There was no doubt about that. Enough that he wanted a record of my number plate so he could no doubt follow up on a strongly held suspicion. And when he did, when the man who'd vowed to kill me finally found me, he'd probably do things that'd make me want to die before he eventually ended me entirely. And as I contemplated that, the hazy vision panic returned and I found myself struggling to breathe. It took a minute, but I managed to calm myself enough that I could think straight, and then as I did so, the solution came to me clear as day, but it was an unthinkable one. The first part, and possibly the easiest, was abandoning my car in that car park, and the next was calling my girlfriend to tell her that she had to go and stay with her mom. She could tell something was wrong just from the sound of my voice, and I promised I'd explain everything face to face as soon as I could. but in the meantime, she had to leave the flat that we shared as quickly as possible and never return to it. Now, it took me hours to walk home, so I had plenty of time to try and reason with her, but in the end, she did as I asked. Then, when I myself got home, I packed up all the essentials, including the bricks of cash that I kept hidden away, and then took a taxi to a friend's house and asked if I could stay with him for a few days. I ended up borrowing his car to drive over to my girlfriend's mom's place, and after sitting her down in private in an upstairs bedroom, I told her everything. She had no idea that I'd been trafficking heroin. She thought that I was repairing all the appliances that I was being sent and then returning them to their owners. My excuse for the Bentley was that I'd been saving it for since I was 16, and since I had an okay salary and was good with money, she bought the excuse without asking any questions. I had this naive idea that she'd stay with me and accept my invitation to move to another city with me, but she didn't. In fact, she broke up with me there and then and said that she never wanted to hear from me ever again. Dealing drugs was one thing, but putting us in danger was another. And if it was only a matter of time before they found me through my car's registration, then she said I needed to leave right that instant. And that was the last time me and her spoke. Then the next day, after buying my mate's car from him for an eye-watering amount of cash, I drove up north, never to return to London. It broke my heart to do it. My parents didn't understand why I was leaving, and since I couldn't bring myself to tell them the truth, I made up a lie about finding a better job in the Northwest. They don't question why I never come to visit, and I'm always insisting that they come to visit me, but I think they suspect something by now. Maybe one day I'll tell them about the stupid, arrogant mistake I made and how it was that which destroyed my relationships and forced me into exile. I ended up selling that Bentley too, by the way, and I had it delivered to Manchester, and it was somewhat of a comfort at first, but it quickly became an enduring reminder of my own greed, as well as the pure devastation that the deep web had caused. Okay, so the TLDR of this is don't F around with the deep web. So even if you don't read this whole thing, take that lesson to heart for the love of God. So I used to screw around with cryptocurrencies in a very big way actually, but I won't bore you with all the nerdy little details. Just know that I was 4 digits into it and always looking for a chance to grow my pot. And so one of the major places for crypto dudes to congregate was the deep web. And this is mostly because they believe the surface web was heavily monitored, which I guess it is, obviously. But it's here that I was introduced to someone named Andre by a mutual friend. Andre said that he ran a crypto investment fund out of Belarus, and that if I made an investment, I could get double, maybe even triple the returns in just a matter of months. Now, the friend who introduced us said that Andre was legit, and so after a few weeks of talking back and forth to see if I could trust the guy, I transferred him the same amount in Bitcoin that my buddy did and then waited to see what he could do with it. Well, as it turned out, Andre could do a lot with it. And week after week, he showed me how the amount in my little pot was growing, and at first it started off slow, but as time went on, that relatively small number got bigger and bigger and bigger. And eventually it got to the point where I didn't want to risk losing such a large amount of crypto. It wasn't exactly some life-changing amount, but withdrawing then meant that I had literally 10 times more money than when I first started. But when I reached out to Andre and asked him how I would go about doing that, he made it very clear that it'd be a very foolish thing to back out then. And he told me not to lose my nerve, and that within a few months my pot could be worth tens of thousands of dollars instead of just a few thousand. I wanted more money, that goes without saying, but at the same time, I knew the longer that he was out there, the bigger the risk of losing it. And so I told Andre that, respectfully, that I'd like to withdraw what I'd earned. Now, he couldn't exactly stop me, but he was incredibly insistent. Not quite to the point of intimidation, but that was just around the corner, it seems. He didn't actually turn on me until I tried to withdraw the amount, at which point I only got back the amount that I initially invested, even though my wallet with Andre now said 0. And that's when I realized that the whole thing was a scam, and how whatever was going on, I certainly wasn't making any money from it personally. Now, I tried complaining to my friend about it, the one who'd put me in touch with Andre, but then he turned on me too. I tried warning him that Andre wasn't what he'd seemed, but my friend wouldn't listen. He told me that I made a big mistake in withdrawing my crypto because I'd put the whole system in jeopardy for everyone else. Now, it still wasn't too late to reinvest, in which case there would be no harm, no foul, but not doing so would leave everyone hanging dry, himself included. And that's when I realized that my friend, emphasis on the quotation marks there, must have been in on it, because nothing I said to him seemed to make a single bit of difference. All that mattered to him was getting me to reinvest by any means necessary, including threats. He told me Andre and his friends were not people I wanted to mess with, but since I was pretty adept at online security, I didn't think that they'd be able to find me. Now, I think on their own that they wouldn't be able to, but since I strongly suspect it was my so-called friend who betrayed my IP address to them, it was easy. Now, it started when they did something to my computer. Something that made it freeze up before an Internet Explorer window opened and some kind of program downloaded and installed itself as I'm screaming no, 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 no over and over. Now, I tried saving my PC by pulling all the wires out of the back, and I even double-checked that my VPN had been properly functioning at the time of the attack. I thought I'd disconnected it just in time, but just a few days later, weird things started happening around my apartment building. I first noticed when I came home that the window nearest my fire escape was open. It didn't look like anyone had been inside my apartment, but I very clearly remember closing the window before I left my apartment that morning. And that was enough to have me looking for someplace else to stay, at least until things blew over. But literally the same night that I went and backed up all my essentials, someone stole my car and I woke up to a note in my mailbox that just said, "Reinvest." Now, I went to stay with my mom that very same day, and over the next couple of days I reported my car stolen and canceled the month-to-month lease on my apartment. It was devastating because I had to basically trash all my devices on the assumption that they were compromised, and it took me years before I was able to fully replace everything. But that wasn't the worst of it. On the day my lease ended, I returned to my apartment to pick up the rest of my things. But when I did, something was waiting for me. I was walking towards my mom's car with a bag of clothes under each arm when a car started to turn down the lot and speeded towards me as it passed. It ended up crashing into the car that I took cover behind, and as it drove off, my mom started to freak the hell out of having to almost watch her boy get smushed. Only then did I come clean on what had happened to me, and you can call me a mama's boy if you want, but seeing her go full bear mama after I had told her was kinda cool. And she sent me to live with my uncle out of state for a while, and she got my dad to teach her how to shoot his gun just in case someone came around in my dad's house looking for me. She made a difficult time a lot easier, and she even offered me a few $100s to get myself a new laptop and a new phone. And I paid her back once I got access to my crypto and cashed it out, but I really, really appreciated what she and my uncle did for me at a time when I honestly thought that I might end up getting murdered over some damn crypto scheme. I don't even know how it all worked either. Like, I think Andre was using our money to make it look like he had this big investment network, which attracted people in the same way a Ponzi scheme does, but I don't know for certain. All I know is that whoever he was, he must have been working with some serious people if they were able to hunt me down and willingly do me harm. Hey friends, thanks for listening. Click that notification bell to be alerted of all future narrations. I release new videos every Monday and Thursday at 9 p.m. Eastern Time, and there are super fun live streams every Sunday and Wednesday night. If you got a story, be sure to submit them over at my email, letsreadsubmissions@gmail.com, and you might even hear your story featured on the next video. And if you want to support me even more, grab early access to all future narrations and bonus content over on Patreon, or click that big join button to hear about the extra perks for members of this YouTube channel. And check out the Let's Read podcast, where you can hear all of these stories in big compilations located anywhere you listen to podcasts. I also have a true crime channel called Saturn Soul that you should totally check out and subscribe to. All links in the description below. Thanks so much, friends. And remember, that's all the time we have today, folks.
Why I oughta.
So many years ago, my parents still lived in the house that I grew up in as a child. The neighbors, Mr. and Mrs. Morse, stuck out to me as a kid as a regimental, stern couple. Now, Mr. Morris was the type of man you can only describe as blustering, and Mrs. Morris was sort of like a human square, with a bowl haircut and a mustache almost as bushy as her husband. Now, if this sounds like being uncharitable to them, hell yeah, I definitely am, and you'll hate these two by the end of the story as well. Unless you're a psychopath, in which case, may I suggest that you live in a cabin in the woods without neighbors. The Morrises were sternly friendly with my parents while me and my siblings grew up. They had this son, August, who was in the Scouts with my elderly brother Barry, and he was sort of like a mini version of his father. Bossy, always demanding to be the leader of the activities, and would become quietly red-faced angry if things didn't go his way. Us kids in the neighborhood had a nickname behind his back, and that of a certain Austrian dictator that I don't think you're allowed to say on YouTube, but let's just say that he's someone that you will not see very often. Now anyway, the son isn't the point here. He was sent off to military boarding school at some point during high school, and the wild thing is that he bragged about asking to be sent there. And so we just grew up around the Morrises, who were pretty stern but polite and mostly just sort of kept to themselves. Occasionally they'd complain if our music was too loud or if we had a barbecue that ran past 9 p.m. And if any of mine or my siblings' balls went into the neighbor's garden or over the boundary hedge, well, you could kiss that goodbye. They would return it, but they would puncture it. My dad asked them why they did this once, and they claimed that the balls always hit some sharp object in their garden, and there was nothing they could do about it. What, was their garden made of spiked pits or something? Now, eventually my brother Barry moved out for college, and then a couple of years later so did I, and then a couple of years after that, Andy moved out to go traveling. And that just left my parents and our much, much younger sibling Sammy, who was only 10 when I was 20. Now one day, my mom FaceTimed me in tears telling me that they were being taken to court by the Morrises. And when I got her to calm down and Dad joined the call, they explained that they'd received a legal letter from the neighbors explaining that our boundary hedge had been encroaching on their land for years, and that my family owed them over $400,000 in reparations for lost revenue for use of the land as expansion for an unspecified business. Now, the reason they called me first was because I was studying law at the time. Immediately, this rang a million alarm bells in my head, and I asked them what distance the hedge was supposedly encroaching on the neighbor's land, and they very meekly told me 1 inch. And I asked them to scan the letter and send it over. I did some research, called a few friends, and discovered that, much as I suspected, the law firm representing the Morrises not only was not reputable, but in fact, entirely imaginary. The Morrises had invented their own law firm and sent a fake threatening letter. And my biggest confusion was why. It was obvious that my parents wouldn't just pay $400,000 without seeking legal counsel. And the answer came a couple of days later when a second letter from the fraudulent law firm arrived. They presented an offer that the bill would be dropped if my parents would agree to shift the boundary hedge 10 feet back, granting a much larger boundary to the neighbors as a sort of cost-free compensation to avoid any monetary demands. Now, this was something that, knowing my parents, if they didn't have a daughter who was a lawyer in training, they may have agreed to that just for a quiet life. Now, I worked it out using some land blueprints and contacted the relevant offices and discovered that the Morrises had applied for an extension to their house and purchased a prefab guest house, but both projects would require them to encroach into my parents' land. And so at the time, I happened to be dating an older guy, who's now my husband, who worked for a law firm specializing in this kind of thing. And he did some digging and checked out some old records, and it turned out that the boundary hedge was in fact around a foot into my parents' property, meaning if anything, the Morrises had been encroaching on our land this entire time. My boyfriend drafted an actual legitimate legal document stating this with the relevant proof, and the letter ended with a confirmation that my family was simply letting things be as long as the Morrises did the same to avoid any kind of escalation. We hoped that being caught red-handed would cause these fools to drop their lies. Clearly, we underestimated just how badly they wanted their extension, or how much money they dropped on this back garden prefab, presumably non-refundable. However, their next move didn't take the form of fake lawyers or legal threats at all. Instead, my parents started receiving notes written like ransom letters, with the letters cut out of various magazines. I'm not joking. They made strange, bizarre threats, such as a promise to kill our pet miniature donkey, something we never even owned, and another letter threatened to poison the koi in our pond. We don't have a pond or koi. The letters were so ridiculous that my parents kept copies, but didn't report them to the police, not at first. But then they became threatening. My parents wouldn't show me the notes directly, but they let slip that the notes names myself and my brothers. And then finally, a note arrived promising that Sammy would never arrive home from school one day when they least expected it, which is when they finally went to the cops. And of course, the cops couldn't prove that the notes came from the Morrises. This harassment went on for 5 years. Acts of petty vandalism, weird pieces of graffiti on the walls of the house, hoses were clipped in the middle of the night with the faucet running so the yard flooded, dead birds and roadkill being left on the doorstep, and the Morrises, these clever idiots, obviously made themselves the victims of their own harassment too, so suspicion didn't fall on them. And then the fires started. Just small, contained fires in the backyard that scorched the lawn. Another classic was that the Morrises would play classical music at full volume at 3:33 a.m. in the morning every single Wednesday. And when it was time for Sammy's exams, they escalated it to every day. My parents filed noise complaints, but the Morrises denied any involvement and, in fact, claimed that they hated classical music. And when investigators were there, somehow they mysteriously managed to know, and the music didn't play on those nights. My eldest brother moved home, and in no uncertain terms threatened the Morrises. The C-words had the gall to call the cops on him, and this further undermined our claims against them. They went so far as to try and suggest that my brother was the one committing the vandalism, despite the fact that he'd been living in a totally different state during most of the incidents and had an alibi for most of it. Now Sammy, meanwhile, was becoming an absolute wreck, and we all felt so hopeless, and it felt like the whole world was against us. In the end, the entire family got together for a family meeting, and we very tearfully decided that the only recourse that we had was to move out of our family home that had been in the family since my mom's childhood. So that's what we did. We put the house up for sale, my parents accepted the first offer they received, and they moved into a smaller house that, realistically, was more manageable for them, especially once Sammy went away to college. There's no happy ending here, really, at least not for us. The lesson is simply that sometimes it's better to walk away than let your entire life be taken up with fighting the fight, even if it is a just and good one. There is an ending, though, but I can't say it's a good one, and as much as I hated the Morrises for what they put us through, I wouldn't wish this on anyone. Remember their son, who willingly went to military school and we nicknamed that Austrian painter? Well, it turns out that Augie had been thrown out of military school, then dishonorably discharged from the military, all without his parents' knowledge. He'd fallen into drugs and violence, and one day, he came home. Augie held his parents at gunpoint with a sawed-off shotgun, zip-tied them back-to-back to dining chairs, and then he and a couple of associates robbed the Morrises of every valuable they could get their hands on, and then, as a parting gift, with the butt of that sawed-off, he shattered both of his father's kneecaps. Nobody knows what caused Augie to hate his parents so much. It's probably not hard to guess, but when he was caught, he kept quiet. And he was caught a few days later as he admitted to what he'd done, but not why he'd done it. He was sent to prison for quite a few years, and Mrs. Morris died shortly after, poetically said to have died of a broken heart. Mr. Morris spent the rest of his years in a hospice, unable to walk, and also never uttered a single word again since that night. And so the new neighbors who bought our family home never had to deal with the neighbors from hell. And the whole story is a reminder of just how completely messed up and pointless the motivations of some people can be, how they can live with themselves when they all cause so much pain, and how when you cause pain to others, sometimes it returns to you tenfold. I don't know if I believe in karma, but in this case, I can't help but feel that no matter how much the Morrises screwed with my family, they got far more than they deserved, and I can only hope their son, Augie, can one day find some peace. Long-time listener, first-time writers, they say, and this happened about a year ago, and holy F, I never thought something this messed up would happen to me and my family. So it all started when my parents, both recently retired, decided to use their part of their life savings to go away on a 6-month world cruise. Not really my jam, but they were psyched about it, and I was psyched for them. And even better, the lease on my apartment was up the week before they left, so I was free to house sit for them the entire time they were gone. This was a relief to my mom, who would have spent the whole cruise in a state of neurosis, calling me or my brother to check on the house every 5 minutes. And knowing that I was living there ironically meant that she wouldn't worry at all. Oh, Mother, if only you'd known. In the week before they left, as I moved my things into my old childhood bedroom ready for the next 6 months, my mom gave me the rundown of the house as if I hadn't grown up there. I barely paid attention to all the things that she was telling me. Yes, Mom, I know where the fridge is, I know the Wi-Fi password, I know how to use the TV. I know the guest room is filled with Aunt Joni's art while she's between husbands, and that I must not dispose of any of it. What I didn't know about, though, was the new neighbor. His name was Mr. Samuels, and he moved in a few months previously. If you believe my mom, Mr. Samuels was an angel sent from heaven. He was the loveliest, sweetest old person, Mom said, despite the fact that he was only a couple of years older than my dad. Now, he baked cakes for the neighbors, so I shouldn't be surprised if he dropped by with some muffins or maybe even some red velvet cake. I admit, I do like a good red velvet cake, so maybe Mr. Samuels was okay by me. Mr. Samuels had a nurse who came by every other day, so I didn't need to worry about him apparently, not that I'd been planning to. Mom did enough worrying for the whole family. I didn't actually see Mr. Samuels before my parents left for their cruise because he was away staying with one of his kids. And so I bid my parents farewell at the docks, waving a handkerchief and sobbing like a wartime bride. Not really, but then headed back to the house, ready for 6 months of hardcore freelance art commissions and watching all the subscription services that my parents subscribed to and I didn't want to pay for. Mr. Samuels returned home a few days into my newfound alone time, and imagine my absolute surprise when the gentle Mr. Rogers-esque fella that I pictured was absolutely nothing like that at all. Mr. Samuels may have been 75 years old, but he was the kind of 75 that looked ex-Navy SEAL, and in fact was, and who probably had a home gym, and he did, and he was a muscular, confidently spoken, weirdly charming man, and at first I wondered why he needed a regular nurse, and then when I first saw the nurse show up for his first appointment, I remember that my mother can be rather naive sometimes. Let's just say that she was the kind of nurse who is paid good money to relieve someone's tension via massage, and just leave it at that. But hey, the man was single, and just because he was old, it didn't mean that he didn't have needs. And every other day at 75? Damn, I was almost in awe. Now, he did bake a very good red velvet cake, and one of his first acts as a welcome gift was to bring a cake over and introduce himself. I'll admit, while he was charming, he also made my skin crawl. I'm a 32-year-old woman, and this 75-year-old man, who looked like he could easily overpower me without a moment's thought, was very clearly trying to rizz me up, as the kids say. And I usually hate the phrase undressing me with his eyes, but there was no better way to describe it here. And Mr. Samuels made no secret of it. He'd make remarks like, "Gladys never said her daughter was so cute," or how he'd wished that he'd known my mom when she was my age, things like that. It would have been flattering if it wasn't so intense, and he wasn't quite so, I don't know how to describe it, but he had this aura where it was obvious that he wanted me to know that he could take me. And I've known guys like this since high school, but never once was he ever twice my age, and he wasn't so much a silver fox as a white wolf, and once I got that image in my head, I couldn't shake it. Thankfully, I didn't have many dealings with Mr. Samuels outside of him bringing over baked goods, and in the end, as much as it hurts me to have to do so, I ended up tossing them out because I was becoming paranoid that he might be slipping something into the baking. I'd watched an Instagram short about a predator who did some fairly gross stuff like that, and I got it inside my own head about it a little. Looking back, I am pretty grateful that I didn't risk it. And so after a month of catching up on art commissions and emailing editors begging for work, I began to go a little stir-crazy. Surprisingly, Mom didn't call anywhere near as much as I expected, and I found myself missing my goofy parents a lot. We had a few Zoom calls, but the internet on the cruise ship wasn't exactly reliable, and so half of the time, it was like watching my folks in stop motion while Mom yelled, "What was that? What did you say, Sel?" over and over, as my name is Celeste, but she calls me Sel. I decided to surprise my parents by giving the house a little bit of a decluttering, or at least the parts that I knew that I was allowed to touch. Aunt Joni's paintings could stay, but I knew that the attic was an absolute crap show of disorganization. Plus, I figured that I'd find a bunch of fun childhood memories up there, and maybe some stuff that was worth a bit of money. I remember my brother having a bunch of old consoles and action figures that surely had to be worth something, and God knows that we both could have used the money since we were both artists. I wasn't in the attic for long before I came to two realizations. One, this was going to be a mammoth job, and two, someone had cut a hole in the drywall between our attic and the adjoining one. And of course, it was Mr. Samuel's attic. Not only that, cables were snaking through the hole, followed them through the maze of boxes and old Christmas decorations, and I was horrified at what I found. Holes had been drilled into the floor, very recently by the look of the sawdust, and two wires snaked down into two rooms. Now, without going into technical details, I traced the wires to the bathroom and the bedroom that I was staying in and discovered that small cameras had been set up, hidden within fake smoke alarms. Now, following the wires back up and creeping into Mr. Samuel's attic, I found a laptop running with active feeds of both rooms. The bedroom camera was angled so you could see the whole room, and the bathroom camera was angled at the shower. And so in short, dear sweet old Mr. Samuels had literally been spying on me for God knows how long and had violated my privacy in the most diabolically disgusting way. I minimized the live feed and found a folder on the desktop marked quote-unquote best of. The contents horrified me. There were a number of videos of me showering, of me changing, and even a couple of where I was, for want of a better term, relieved some tension of being single in bed. Now, without thinking, in utter disgust, I deleted the entire folder and emptied the recycle bin, and then immediately realized the idiotic move I'd made. Subconsciously, though, I think my brain drove me to do so in order to avoid considering law enforcement, and more on that later. I wanted revenge on Samuels, but I also wanted him to live with fear of the revenge. Now, my first step was to sever the wires connecting the cameras. My second step was to head downstairs and reach out to a friend of mine who was, how do I put this, good with computers. He sent me a piece of software to install on Mr. Samuel's computer via a USB stick that would completely mess up not only his laptop, but any computer connected to the same router. Irreparably, my friend promised. Now, I should add here that I knew Samuels was out of town for a few days, supposedly visiting his daughters again. Now, who knows what he really got up to? It could have been literally anything. And he was due back the next day, so I hurried and installed the virus on his laptop via that USB stick. I followed my friend's instructions and then forced myself to leave the attic and wait a day or so for Mr. Samuels to return. And I could tell when he discovered the outcome of his deception. From his laptop speaker, a robotic voice began blaring, "I'm a voyeur pervert and I also have kids," over and over again. Above me, I could hear Samuels freaking out until he slammed that laptop shut. Then I heard his footsteps thundering down the stairs, presumably to his other main PC, and I waited and then, "I'm a voyeur pervert and I also have kids." According to my friend, there was absolutely no way to get rid of this unless you were a tech genius or whatever. Something about writing it to the root of the BIOS or something, so even a hard drive wipe and Windows reinstall wouldn't fix it. And something told me that while Mr. Samuels might be capable of setting up a pervert spy network, he wasn't capable of fixing this. I was right, because the next weekend, I saw his entire desktop PC smashed into little bits sitting out on the sidewalk for the garbage collection. Hilariously, they wouldn't take electronics, so it was just sort of left there until the HOA contacted him about the unsightly garbage, and the next day, a snapped laptop joined the pile. Now, I'm sure he suspected me because the baking delivery stopped, and he also avoided eye contact with me whenever we'd pass each other, coming and going. Now, I still felt sick that this dirty, disgusting old perv had gotten away with getting off to me at my most vulnerable, though. I kept consoling myself with the reminder that he was 75 and would be dead long before me, but then I had nightmares about how he might have sent the videos to other like-minded perverts. No matter how much I reminded myself that the low-quality, grainy pictures made my identity impossible to discern, it didn't help because Samuels could easily have doxed me. I lived in fear of something else happening, but nothing else did. I confessed my fears to my friend, though, who suggested one final idea. I don't know exactly what he did, but a few days later, a smartphone arrived in the mail. My friend told me to stick it through Samuel's mailbox in the middle of the night and just leave it at that. And I asked him why and what the phone contained, but he told me it was better that I didn't know. I posted the phone. Whatever was on there had caused Samuels to become a recluse, and the rest of my house sitting went without incident. And after a while, I noticed that the nurse was no longer coming to visit Samuels. Good. And that man didn't deserve any joy in his life. And eventually my parents returned from their cruise. I didn't tell them anything about what had happened. I was honestly just too ashamed, and too worried that my dad, the mild-mannered as he was usually, would spend his remaining years in prison for killing their next-door neighbor if he knew what he'd done to his baby girl. Now, a few months after I moved out into my own place again, Mom mentioned that Mr. Samuels had been placed into an assisted living facility by his children. She said it was all very strange, like he mentally declined within the space of a year. Now, I said nothing, but I had to suppress a smile there. I don't know if I did the right thing by not calling the cops and handling everything in this very unusual way, but here's the reason. When I was in college, I was assaulted. My experience with the police was, well, as I'm sure some of you know, not so good. And I was made to feel like it was all my fault because of how I dressed and because I'd had maybe 2 drinks, because I'd been affectionate with my assailant. I know all cops aren't like that. I know that plenty of cops are sympathetic, even heroic with certain victims, but I was not one of them. And the idea of trying to convince them that my elderly neighbor was spying on me, even though realistically the evidence was all there, it just terrified me. And so maybe I handled things pretty badly. Maybe me and my friend taking justice into our own hands was an immoral decision, but honestly, knowing what that man was capable of in his 70s, I can only imagine the things that he may have done when he was younger, fitter, and more savvy at getting away with it. And knowing he's spending the last years of his life slowly losing his mind in an assisted living facility, probably being spoon-fed baby food by a tattooed male orderly who he can't sexually harass, well, honestly, I sleep at night just fine. I do still periodically check for spy cams, though, as I'm quite paranoid and you can never be too careful. Do any of you have someone who you'll never forget, even though you never really knew them that well? Someone who was a constant in your life, just sort of a background character who isn't around anymore. Someone you find your mind drifting back to every now and then because even though you didn't know them that much, you just saw them all the time and they were like an interactive, friendly part of the furniture. Now, I don't mean that in a derogatory way. It's like a beloved lazy boy that you get from Goodwill. You don't know its backstory, and you never will, and you don't ask about its past, and it doesn't ask about yours. Christ, this sounds dehumanizing, but it's how I think about it. It's in a fond, loving way, trust me, and I hope one day I'm someone else's goodwill lazy boy, someone who touched a person's life just by being there and someone they'll always remember. Now, I remember Mr. Browning. I'll never forget him, and even though the last time I saw him was probably 1985, I think I remember him fondly regardless of how things ended. Now, I sure know that I always thought fondly whenever this guy crossed my mind. Me and the wife often talked about how we should invite him over for dinner. We wondered if he was lonely after his wife had passed a decade or so before, and we wondered if his adult kids called often because they never seemed to visit. But we just never got around to asking Mr. Browning. Hell, I don't even remember what his Christian name was. It was always, "Good morning, Mr. Browning," and he'd respond with, "Good morning, Ted." He was my elder. We understood the hierarchy, and I do know that he was a former teacher, so maybe he thought of himself as Mr. Browning. Maybe it didn't even cross his mind to ask me to call him by his first name. Amos, that was it. Amos Browning, and I remember from his obituary and later the funeral. And I think those were the only times that I heard his first name spoken, and one of the only times that I saw his adult children. His son was a very doughy-faced man who looked bored to be at his father's funeral. His daughter was one of those sharp-faced women with a meek, sycophantic husband and the kind of bratty son who wanted to be the center of attention, even at Grandpa's wake. We didn't stay long. We'd gone to pay our tributes to Mr. Browning, but we couldn't stay. We didn't want his family asking us questions about his death, and they likely knew that I'd been present when it happened, and I'm not a good liar. I would have struggled to give them the answers they wanted instead of the horrible, haunting, traumatizing truth. Me and Mr. Browning used to chat over the fence. Well, I'd lean over the fence and he'd mow the lawn, and he was always mowing his lawn. He had one of those old push mowers, an electric one, and I just kept trying to persuade him to buy a ride-on, but he said his yard was way too small for that. It wasn't, and besides, at his age, probably early 70s, it was a great way to get some exercise and a little peace and quiet. Peace and quiet from who, I'm not really sure, since he lived alone after his wife had passed before me and my family moved in, but that's what he said. We'd talk, a lot, but never really get to know each other, you know. We talked about the Detroit Lions a bunch. He was a die-hard supporter, and I was just a pretty casual one. And we talked about the weather, we talked about politics, but never too seriously, and sometimes we'd watch the same shows at the same time and we'd talk about those too. We both loved Miles Davis and The Who and Kiss, and he told me about his first ever concert, sneaking in to watch Kiss play, but I was never sure if he was telling the truth or just recounting the plot of that one movie where that exact thing happens. It was a fun story anyhow, even if he told me about 5 times, and occasionally he'd ask about my wife and how she was doing and how her job was going, but I think he wanted to talk about his wife in exchange but couldn't bring himself to do so, apart from that one time. Sometimes my wife would bring him a lasagna or some other baked goods, and he'd thank her like a perfect gentleman, and he always handed the dishes back to me over the fence, never once brought them to our door, always over the fence. Now, I chatted to him so much that by the time we moved out, there was a groove in the ground where grass had stopped growing in the place where I had always stood to talk to Mr. Browning. Now, I remember exactly what we were talking about on the day it happened. My wife had just had a minor operation to remove a benign cyst from her breast, and he was asking how she was doing. I told him she was doing fine and would be home from the hospital the next day or even that evening if things went well. Mr. Browning looked at me then as he was mowing the lawn and then told me that I was lucky and I should hold on to a good woman like that. And then he said, and I'll never forget it, not least because they were his last words, he said, "I miss her so much." And then he sort of looked down, away like he was about to hide tears, but I saw a look of alarm and then fear cross his face. Maybe I'm just imagining, but I swear that I saw him try and stop the forward motion of the mower as he pushed forward. I'm not sure how it happened. He was always so careful, running the electrical extension cable around the edge of the lawn, making sure that he was mowing nowhere near it, being careful like it was muscle memory. But I heard the crunch and whir of the motor running over the electrical socket and the cable. I don't know how or why, but there was no grounding. The mower's rubber handles just sort of weren't there anymore, and the live electrical cables got tangled into the motor blades, mangling and electrifying the mower as Mr. Browning held onto it. And hold onto it he did. I watched in abject frozen horror as his body began to convulse, as smoke rose up from his hands where he was gripping the metal handle. I could smell the cooking flesh and electrical burn. I watched as the grass around him singed and blackened, and I knew I had to knock him away from the mower but couldn't touch him myself. I searched for something, anything that I could safely use to shove him off the mower. My eyes settled on my old wooden baseball bat, but by the time I'd hauled myself over that fence, I knew it was too late. Mr. Browning had collapsed to the ground, finally letting go of the lawnmower, and I knew that there was no saving him, so I ran over to the outlet and switched off the electricity. Then I went back over to my neighbor, my friend who I knew so little about, and he was blackened and charred. His face was horrific. His eyeballs had somehow survived the electrocution, and they stared white and frozen out of a face that looked like it had been sucked clean from the inside. One detail I remember, one grim detail, is how his mouth was open and how I realized that he had false teeth because they had fallen down into his throat. I ran into his house and called 911, and the rest was a blur of paramedics and police and being questioned. And at first, when his daughter got there, she seemed to somehow blame me for her father's death, as if she'd ever given a crap about him in life. He may not have opened up to me, but Mr. Browning certainly made it clear that his kids did not play a big part in his life. And so fast forward to the funeral, the son gave a eulogy, and it was like he barely knew his father any better than I did. It made me so sad and devastated that this man who seemed like nothing but a nice, amicable gentleman could have been so forgotten and discarded, except for the neighbor who gave him some friendly, superficial banter over the fence, the same neighbor who was forced to watch him die. I swore then that when I had a kid, I would do everything I could to make sure that they wanted me in their life forever. And as it turned out, my wife was unknowingly pregnant at the time of that funeral. We had a son and then later 2 daughters, and they were the loves of my life. They're all grown themselves now with families of their own, and my wife and I are grandparents, and we make sure to keep our family close, regular meals together, Christmas and Thanksgiving being particularly huge affairs. Now, maybe Mr. Browning hadn't been a great father. It's not for me to judge his kids for distancing themselves from him. I don't judge them for their relationship with their father. It just sort of makes me sad. But before the sadness came the trauma. We bought our home with the intention of starting a family there, but every time I so much as stepped foot in the backyard, I was met with flashbacks of Mr. Browning cooking alive. I could smell that electric burn and see those bulging dead eyes. We made a loss selling, but we moved, and my son was born in a smaller house, but it was one filled with love and closeness, and I was no longer haunted by the sight of my neighbor's final moments, at least not directly. Like I said, I'll always remember Mr. Browning, and part of that means being cursed with remembering how I played witness to his demise. Evening, let's read. I'm a normal, regular-ass guy with a wife and kid. I lead a quiet life, I work in a bank, and I'm the last person to get involved in drama or scary situations or anything that you might want to hear about on your channel. At least, that's how I've always wanted to live my life anyway. Sometimes you don't have a choice, and that lack of choice doesn't come from your own actions, but from those around you. In my case, it was a house. And even before all of this happened, we used to call it the Nightmare House. We, being me and the other neighbors who were mostly friends, we'd do safari suppers, quiz nights at the local bar, all sorts of stuff like that. And apart from a handful of residents who had good reason, everyone got involved, and it was a nice, friendly community. And then there was the house next door to mine. The owner never joined us for events or hung out, and he never attended street parties or barbecues or singing carols during Christmas. Not because he was antisocial, but because we never once even met him. He'd never lived in the house, not since any of us could remember. Old Mr. Peterson said he could vaguely remember the owner from when he'd first bought the property a few decades back, but since then, nothing. And for whatever reason, This guy had bought the house and then just screwed off to South Africa or some such place and just left the property to gradually fall into ruin. And there must have been a caretaker at some point because ever since any of us could remember, all the windows were boarded up and the doors were sealed with planks, but beyond that, it was clear that nobody cared for the property. The yards front and back were both overgrown and almost jungle-like, and the neighbors sometimes considered trying to maintain the outside a little, but good God. We all had our own lives and properties, and it wasn't like we were some uptight homeowners association. It was just kind of annoying to have this eyesore right in the middle of our normal suburban neighborhood. We kind of joked around about the owner, like he was a vampire who lived in the basement and the abandonment was some ruse or gallows humor and he died years ago and nobody noticed. And this joke kind of weighed on us, and one of the neighbors contacted the district for, I don't know, some kind of international wellness check. Now, we were assured that the owner was perfectly fine and living abroad and had every right to leave his property the way it was, as long as it wasn't in danger of collapsing or causing a safety hazard. And then the graffiti started, and we knew that it was a few of the neighborhood kids letting off some steam, including, I suspected, my own 15-year-old son, and so none of us really did anything about it. But slowly and surely, the building started to get tagged, scribbled at first, and then some genuinely kind of impressive artwork, and it was better than the squat brick monstrosity with the boarded-up windows, I guess. One piece was a parody of that British artist Banksy, and I am absolutely certain that one was my son because he'd conveniently been asking me about Banksy a few weeks before the art appeared. And so yeah, we called it the Nightmare House, but it was all in good fun, and if the owner cared about the graffiti or the yard turning into the Amazon, then he certainly never let that on. And for all I know, there was nobody in the vicinity who was even in touch with him, and he simply didn't know or care. Why he bought the house and left it to rot was anyone's guess. I know the answer now, but that can wait until the end of the story. We first noticed that something was up with the Nightmare House when one day, the boards over the front door disappeared. That was all, nothing more, just that. Murmurs spread through the neighborhood. Had the owner finally returned after his decades-long estrangement from his poop hole of a house? Had he employed a caretaker? Had he sold the property? Sadly, none of the answers were this positive, as we'd soon learn. Squatters had moved in. And looking back, it's wild that this hadn't happened before now. The place was rife for squatting, and yet it had remained untouched. Not anymore, though. A few of us kept watch. Yeah, I know this makes us sound like curtain-twitching Karens, but some of us had young kids and we wanted to know what kind of squatters we were dealing with here. And we counted 4 regulars who clearly lived there and a bunch of others who came and went. And it was pretty obvious from the get-go that these weren't student squatters or struggling homeless people who just wanted a warm place for the night. One of the guys, the leader I would call them, was bald and covered in tattoos. He had about 5 visible teeth, and when he was shirtless, which was often, you could see vicious purple track marks running up and down his forearms. And he wasn't the kind of addict that you could feel sorry for, though. This guy was nasty. If he saw one of us even glancing in his direction, he'd hiss and let loose a torrent of abuse. He really wanted to establish the fact that this was his neighborhood now, and none of us better F with him. The other squatters called him Crunk. What a name, though. And then there was Blippo and F-Jockey. Not exactly how that name went. Then there was Blippo and F-Jockey. Not exactly sure how that name went, and they were almost as bad as him. F-Jockey was missing a leg just below the knee, and sometimes he'd hobble around on a rusty prosthetic, and other times he'd traverse the broken pathways of the Nightmare House in a cranky old wheelchair, and I'm amazed that thing even really moved. And finally there was Finlay, who was the least worst of the 4. He'd at least occasionally offer mumbled apologies to the neighbors, while sort of skulking around wearing the same gray hoodie that he always wore. And he also clearly never washed it because you could smell him coming a mile off or smell where he'd been. And this is why I say that he was the least worst rather than a good guy, because when the thefts started, the crime scenes often reeked of Finlay, and he was the smallest and thinnest of the squatters, and we were certain that he was the one sneaking into neighbors' houses and stealing food and essentials. Never anything valuable, nothing that could cause too much of a rage, but someone was stealing our bread and our Twinkies, our detergent, that kind of stuff. And of course, he somehow managed to slip in and out unnoticed without violently breaking and entering, and so whenever we reported these thefts to the cops, it sounded kind of pathetic. "Oh, hey, officer, yeah, someone stole a bunch of bananas from the counter," or "Excuse me, detective, but our mop's gone missing and I can smell the aftermath of some homeless man." What we did try doing was reporting the squatters to the authorities, but apparently there are laws and protections for squatters, particularly ones that require the property's owner to make the report themselves. The cops told us that the owner wouldn't even respond to them about it, and he was almost impossible to track down in whichever foreign country he lived in anyway, so for all they could prove, the squatters were legitimate tenants. They weren't, of course, you could just tell, but without the owner actually confirming this or filing any kind of charges, they were free to come and go in their adopted home as they pleased. And they would do all sorts of stupid and creepy crap that gradually wore us down. My family, me, my wife, and my 2 kids were their direct neighbors, so we got the brunt of the hassle. And it started with dumb stuff, like connecting my garden hose to an outdoor faucet, and then swiping the hose and using it to fill their outdoor pool. And this was during a time when using hoses was banned, so I only found out about this when I received a letter warning me about my property's water usage. And even though I couldn't prove for sure that it was the squatters, but the hose had been left right by the fence and they mysteriously had a full pool in their back garden. Not an actual one or anything, it was like a large kiddie pool, but still. Now, one time I did catch them. They'd connected an extension cord to our outdoor electricity outlet and snaked it over the fence to plug in what appeared to be an in-progress stereo stack system like you'd find in the 80s. And it seemed like they were building some kind of outdoor sound system under a makeshift gazebo they'd erected. And in retrospect, I should have been more alarmed by what this implied, but I was too mad about the electrical theft. I just unplugged the extension cord, and despite my wife pleading for me to just let it go, I stormed next door. F-Jockey answered the door, laying it on heavy about how hard it had been for him to answer the door trying to play the victim, but I was having none of it. I demanded to speak to Crunk. F-Jockey told me to wait and then shut the door in my face. Now I could hear him yelling for Crunk inside and then heard Crunk's response, and he sounded pretty heavily high on whatever. And when he eventually came to the door, his eyes were bloodshot and he still had a rubber strap tied around his upper arm. To his credit, it was the first time that he'd ever been polite and amicable. He apologized, very sincerely, for stealing my electricity, but told me that he thought that I wouldn't mind, because I seemed like such a nice, generous guy who clearly cared for his neighbors. And then he started going on about how we were all children of Gaia, and how electricity was a tool of the man, and if we didn't share it and spread it around, then we were just doing what they wanted. It was nonsense, but the way he spoke and the cadence of his voice, there was something hypnotic about it. I somehow found myself agreeing to let him use my outdoor outlet, and as I walked away, I kind of realized how Charles Manson managed to get so many followers. Some people just have something about them, no matter how obnoxious and vile they seem to be, and Crunk was clearly one of these people. The more I thought about it, the more dangerous I realized he could potentially be. I knew that we either had to drive those squatters out or somehow integrate them into the community. At our next hangout with the neighborhood guys, we decided that we'd try the latter. We'd invite them to our next cookout and try and make them feel welcome. Maybe they could help. And I was the one hosting the neighborhood cookout, so they could just hop the fence and join us for burgers and beers. I didn't have the opportunity to invite them to the cookout, though, as the next day, I went to get the barbecue grill set up for the summer and give it the usual routine maintenance and a good clean. And to my surprise, the space it usually occupied on my back porch was just empty. It wasn't a tiny barbecue grill either. It was a good 4 feet wide, a decently expensive piece of kit. How they got it over the fence and into the Nightmare House's yard is beyond me even now. But steal it they did, which I confirmed by glancing over the fence and saw Crunk and the boys grilling burgers on my grill, which they hadn't cleaned, so it was giving off a bit of a stench. When Crunk saw me looking, he waved and gave me a whole, "Hey neighbor, want to come over for some patties?" Now I kind of just let out that it was my grill, and Crunk sort of beamed this wide, toothless smile and said, yeah, he knew. He thought he'd give it a trial run for me before barbecue season started actually. And that was, of course, that they'd clean it all up and return it unharmed when they were done with it. I just felt helpless. What the hell was I supposed to say? I felt positioned on a knife's edge, like everything was just about balanced right now, but a single nudge and my entire life would collapse straight into the blade. I don't know if I'm expressing just how intimidating it all was, but ever since they moved in, it was just these looks, these sneers, these snatches of overheard conversation that I couldn't prove were about me and the neighbors, but were definitely talking about how they'd mess things up for anyone who gave them a hassle. And Crunk had these eyes that had a sort of dead glint to them. Crazy eyes, just like Manson or any of those cult leader guys. Now maybe I'm just a pussy, but I genuinely felt like if I dared to fight back in any way, something terrible would befall me and my family. My cowardice changed that weekend, though. I've been working late into the night, so I didn't get up until just past midday, and my wife was out at her job. My son was camping with some buddies, so I called for my daughter to say hi, but she was nowhere to be found. I brewed my morning, now afternoon, coffee and stepped into the yard for a little cigarette. I know, smoking will kill you. Don't start it, kids. Anyways, I could smell cooking meat and the pungent smell of my uncleaned grill, and I could hear music playing on the stereo system that the squatters had set up using my electricity. And I could hear voices. Crunk, F-Jockey, Blippo, Finlay, a couple of unfamiliar male voices, a few female voices, and then a very familiar voice sounding kind of unsure and nervous. It was my daughter. My now 16-year-old daughter somehow next door with these filthy squatters. And feeling like a kind of weirdo but not wanting to look like one, I looked over the fence. And there she was, in that weird kiddie pool that they'd filled using my hose. She was wearing a bikini, one that I'd had no idea she even owned because if I had, I would have had severe words for her about wearing it out, considering it barely covered anything and she was 16 for Christ's sakes. And there she was, in that pool with Crunk, who I could unfortunately see was completely naked, sidling up to my daughter and trying to persuade her to free herself and lose those clothes like the rest of them. And that's when I noticed the other 3 naked girls lounging around that yard. They looked older than my daughter, but only just, and there were a couple of guys, and F-Jockey and Blippo, all completely nude, sprawled out around the garden, eating these greasy burgers and smoking what I definitely could smell was pot. And how the hell they'd talk my daughter into going over there in just that scrap of a bikini, I'll never know. Following the event, she didn't want to talk about it, and I could tell that she was ashamed and scared, so I never really pushed her on it. All I know is that she implied that Crunk was incredibly persuasive, in exactly the way that I'd considered when I compared him to Charles Manson. A red mist overtook me. I grabbed the first weapon I had, a shovel, and managed to pull myself over the 6-foot-high fence and leap into the squatter's garden. With a blow that impressed even myself, I punctured that kiddie pool with the shovel and then pressed it up against Crunk's throat before anyone had a chance to react. I saw Blippo, the biggest of the guys, start to stand up, and I told him that if he moved a muscle, his buddy would be missing a head. And all the while, I noticed Finlay standing in the corner of the yard kind of shaking, looking like he was going through H withdrawals. Jesus Christ, what a life these people led. And Crunk raised his hands and started on about how I was freaking out over nothing, that I was being a controlling father, that my daughter was an adult in her own person and could do what she wanted. Now at this point I was shaking with rage and struggling not to deprive my kids of a father by committing first-degree murder. I told Crunk through these gritted teeth that my daughter was in fact not an adult and was a 16-year-old child. Meanwhile, my daughter was crying and begging me to forgive her, saying that she was sorry, begging me not to think less of her, things like that. It broke my heart, and I told her that I didn't judge her at all, but I couldn't look at her in the moment. Not that I wouldn't, but I was just too hesitant to take my eyes off of Crunk. I told my daughter to get out of the now deflated kiddie pool, grab a towel, and head back to our house now. Crunk had the absolute gall to moan that it was his towel and we couldn't steal it, and I responded by pressing the shovel, brand new and unblunted by lack of use, right against his stupid throat. And I think he knew I was serious. And then when I was sure that my daughter had left the backyard, I said, "I'm gonna go now," and I slowly backed away. As I was leaving, I left them with one final warning. I suggested that they find a new place to squat because my patience was at an end and I wouldn't be so forgiving next time. I said a bunch of other stuff too, like if they ever came near my daughter again it would be the end of them, and that they were no longer going to steal my crap, that kind of thing. And I swear to God, Crunk just smiled at me and said, "May the Lord bless and watch over you." And I remember shivering as I left their back gate and followed my daughter back to our house. For some reason, I didn't think that the Lord which Crunk referred to was the same Lord I worshipped in church most Sundays. And the squatters didn't move out. We had a neighborhood meeting in which we discussed potential ideas of getting rid of them. None of them were any good. They either involved violence or had no chance of working, and we all left feeling very dejected. But then a mysterious stranger solved the problem for us. One evening, all the squatters were out doing God knows what people like that do, and, at least from what I overheard them suspecting, a drug dealer they'd pissed off sent his goons around and firebombed that house with a couple of Molotov cocktails, or something. And the goons somehow got in through the backyard, hurled those cocktails through the back windows, which the squatters had removed the boards from sometime previously. By the time the fire department put the blaze out, the house was a charred husk. Nobody would be living there anytime soon, and no security camera captured footage of the culprits. No arrests were made, and no evidence was found. The squatters moved on, and the neighbors all celebrated their departure despite the scare of the fire. I celebrated too, but there was something that I kept to myself. I'd installed an outdoor security camera after the incident with my daughter, and it captured the neighboring property's yard, and I told the cops that I hadn't gotten around to setting it up yet, but that was a lie. You see, the camera didn't capture a bunch of drug dealer henchmen showing up to burn the place down. It captured a single figure, leaving my house in his beloved Nirvana hoodie, and it showed him vaulting over the fence, and with shaking hands, throwing that Molotov into the property, and then it showed him climbing back over the fence and disappearing back into my house. My son and daughter are twins, and my son is incredibly protective over his sister, and we never spoke about the incident. After I viewed and deleted that footage, I spoke to my wife in front of my son and said that they are very lucky that the fire hadn't spread to our house, that the firebombers needed to be more responsible. Responsible, my wife asked and laughed. I just nodded and gave my son a look. One day, I'm going to have to talk with him. I'm going to have to tell him that he must never ever do anything as insane as that again, that violence isn't the answer, that no matter how sure he was that the squatters were all out, he couldn't be 100% sure. But not just yet. For now, I'm just still celebrating their departure and the return of the owner who, due to the structural damage, was able to have the property demolished. Now, for one final sting in the tail, the owner of the property joined us in the bar one night, and he apologized profusely for how things had played out. He explained that he grew up in that house as a foster child, and while he didn't go into detail, he told us that he suffered there, and he called it the Nightmare House, which caused us all to shoot each other a look. He explained that he'd grown up and put the past behind him and become a successful software engineer back when the internet was first taking off. And then, when he saw the house was up for sale in the market, he bought it with the intention of having it demolished then. But he was denied permission by the district for some reason or another, and instead he was left owning the property filled with this cancerous memory like an albatross around his neck. And so his way of getting revenge on the house was to let it rot, and again he apologized profusely for not considering the effect that would have on the rest of the neighborhood. But now, with the damage to the house, he'd finally been granted permission to have it knocked down and had decided that he was going to turn the land into a graffiti art area and a skate park, having seen photos of some of the graffiti before the squatters moved in. He ended the night by saying that he wished he could thank the arsonists and then looked around at all of us. Now, I'm sure he thought one of us had burned the place down, and honestly, even knowing a hint of the dark memories that place held for him, I'm not surprised that he was grateful that he could finally wake up from the nightmares of the Nightmare House. As for what became of those squatters, who knows? And frankly, after the crap they pulled, who cares? So recently, I moved into an apartment block in a pretty artsy area of a pretty artsy neighborhood. Now, I won't dox myself, but you can probably guess one of two places I mean, and it's not the New York one. I love this apartment building. It was more of a boarding house, really. Only 8 apartments and the top floor belonging to the building super. And all the neighbors were really friendly, and most of us were artists of some sort. And there was me, a painter, and then we had a singer, a couple of writers, 2 more painters, and a mixed media artist, and apparently a sculptor. The sculptor was the neighbor directly across from me. Nobody knew his name, or even if he definitely was a he. He just went by the moniker TTT, all capital. The rest of us would often have sort of group brainstorm evenings where we'd chat about art and set the world to rights, in the common room or TV room that we all shared on the ground floor. Triple T never joined us, of course, and soon the mysterious sculptor became the subject of fascination for a group of creatives with hefty imaginations and too much time on our hands, obviously. Nearly all of the theories about TTT's true identity were ridiculous. Most of them were supernatural, and one of the painters absolutely swore that Triple T was Shia LaBeouf and claimed that she'd seen him when he moved in. And when we showed her a photo of Shia LaBeouf, though, she said it was the other Shia LaBeouf, and we could never quite work out what she actually meant by that. One of the writers decided that Triple T was a ghost, like in the movie Ghost, and that his sculptures were all clay pots, and he was waiting for his Demi Moore to sit at the pottery wheel so he could finally create again. The singer claimed that Triple T was a beautiful woman whose face had been disfigured in a terrible car accident, which explained why some of her sculptures displayed in local galleries showed various figures in states of damage. Me, I just thought that Triple T was a reclusive sculptor who valued their privacy, and whenever TTT had a new sculpture to display, it would be found standing outside their apartment, and men in some suits from a certain gallery would come to collect it. Triple T always displayed at the same gallery, which I can't name for the same reason as not wanting to reveal myself. I did try knocking on Triple T's door a few times. Once or twice, I heard signs of life, and one time I was absolutely certain that I was being watched through a peephole. And just a gut feeling, but it did make me shiver. But if Triple T wasn't answering, I wasn't going to keep prying in there. And that's why it shocked me when, one Friday evening, I stepped out of my apartment ready to attend one of our weekly brainstorming sessions, only to see T's apartment door open a crack. Only darkness spilled from within, and I didn't want to enter without permission, so I just said, "Hello?" through the gap. No answer, although I was sure that I heard movement inside. The door was open. Someone could be in trouble, I thought. That was just sort of a justification enough to take a peek inside, right? And I turned on the flashlight app on my phone, but covered it with my palm just in case. And when I stepped inside, it was completely pitch black in there. I raised my phone, warning whoever was in there that I was about to light up the room, and then I slowly moved my hand away from the lens. I was not prepared for what I saw. The room was entirely bare. The walls and floor were sealed in plastic wrap. You know, the kind that they use in Dexter or some serial killer movies when they're about to kill someone in a room and don't want to leave blood splatter. And that wasn't the creepy part, though. The real creepy part was the statue that stood in the center of the room. It wasn't some kind of horror mannequin. It wasn't some horrific effigy of myself or anything else in the building. It was a classic-looking statue of the Holy Mother Mary, the kind that you find in a Catholic church. The only strange thing about her was that instead of a normal face, she'd been painted up to look like, of all things, a mime. I can't explain it, but I was absolutely certain that the statue was watching me. I was certain somehow that Triple T was the statue. The statue was Triple T. I took a tentative step forward and tapped the Mary statue. It was porcelain, and against my better judgment, I started to reach up and touch the face. It looked like flesh. And it looked so much like human flesh. My fingertips were less than an inch away, and I was about to touch it. I was about to touch TTT. And then I heard a noise in the room behind me. It was sort of like a muffled cry, like the word help. And I snatched my hand back from that statue and hurried to the door directly behind the statue. And it was the only door in the room. And before trying to open it, I called out hello again. No response. I grabbed the door handle and twisted it. The door was locked, but the moment I twisted the door open, I heard a loud, shattering crash behind me. Quickly whipping around, I saw the Mother Mary statue shattering and collapsing to the floor. I had no idea what to do. Had I just destroyed some priceless artifact? I walked up to that debris as carefully as I could, and the face was just laying there, and I'd been right. It was skin, sort of. It was a latex ball with Mary's face painted on it, and then a voice spoke from an unseen speaker somewhere in the room. I am TTT. This is art. You are the art. Please leave. And so I left. I left and ran down the stairs and cursed myself a million times for not filming what I'd just seen. I told everyone what had happened and we all rushed upstairs, but TTT's door was once again locked. And once again, I was certain that as we all stood there, someone was watching us through that peephole. And 2 days later, there was a small portable safe left outside of TTT's apartment, and the same guys in suits came to collect it. 2 days later after that, I received a gilded invitation in the mail to attend a private showing at Gallery Redacted before it opened to the public, and the invite was from Triple T themselves. Of course, I went, hoping to meet the reclusive sculptor. No such luck. Triple T's agent was there and informed me that Triple T's final piece was being unveiled that night. Unlike all their other pieces, it was a video. It was a video showing me entering the apartment, a black bar across my face to protect my identity. It showed me from various camera angles, cameras that must have been hidden in the walls, in the ceiling, and then it showed me from the perspective of Mother Mary's eyes. And for a second, just a few frames, the sensor bar disappeared and my face was replaced by that of a skull. And then it showed me rushing for the door, and here, the camera split into two joint shots, one showing me turning the doorknob, the other showed the statue trembling and collapsing, clearly triggered by some kind of mechanism in the door. Then the rest mostly played out how I described it. Except as I picked up Mother Mary's head, again the sensor bar disappeared from my face and this time briefly showed an angel, like a Greek sculpture. And the final shot of the video was simply text saying, "Life is clay, and you are all my sculpture. Goodbye, TTT." That was the only time the video was shown. I've tried to track down a copy for this last year. If anyone out there has any leads at all, please let me know in the comments. But holy crap, this was the creepiest and most bizarre thing to happen to me, and I am obsessed with getting a copy of this video. If anyone has any leads, anyone at all, please comment. I need to see it again. I need to understand why Triple T was trying to say this and what it says about me. All the other artists in the boarding houses have theories, and I'll leave you to make up your own. But there's one thing I've learned from all of this, one universal truth that speaks to us all in our very soul. Artists are freaking weird, man. Hey friends, thanks for listening. Click that notification bell to be alerted of all future narrations. I release new videos every Monday and Thursday at 9 p.m. Eastern Time, and there are super fun live streams on Sundays and Wednesday nights. If you got a story, be sure to submit them over at my email, letsreadsubmissions@gmail.com, and you might even hear your story featured on the next video. And if you want to support me even more, grab early access to all future narrations and bonus content over on Patreon. And if you want to support me even more, grab early access to all future narrations and bonus content over on Patreon, or click that big join button to hear about the extra perks for members of the channel. And check out the Let's Read podcast, where you can hear all of these stories and big compilations located anywhere you listen to podcasts. And I also have a true crime channel called Saturn's Soul. All links in the description below, so thanks so much, friends. And remember to ride your mountain bike with the seat off. Many, many moons ago now, back when I was a college kid with a bright future ahead of me, I volunteered as a trail guide at the McCurtain County Wilderness area down in southeast Oklahoma. Having grown up on the ranch my pa worked at, I'd always been an outdoorsy kind of guy. Not a cowboy by any stretch, but I knew which end of the bullets came out of a rifle. And I think I'd have been happy working on that ranch too, if only to stay close to family. But my pa always did want more for me, so when the time came, I decided to make him proud by becoming a lawyer. I studied at Texas A&M, then while I was there, I heard about the volunteer program. It wasn't offering any extra credit, but the university would pay my expenses, so it amounted to a sort of free spring break vacation in my native Oklahoma. The county wilderness area was a real hidden gem, with about 14,000 acres of rugged Ouachita mountain terrain stretching right up to the Arkansas state line. It's got the thick pine forests with cool, clean creeks running through them, and then all kinds of wildlife too, like deer and turkeys and the occasional black bear. It's a prime spot for hiking, fishing, all that kind of stuff. But some folks don't feel entirely comfortable out in the wilderness all alone, and that's where I came in. Now, I led groups on trails like the Beach Creek Loop or up to the overlooks to point out the native plant and bird species, along with a little Choctaw history since their roots are deep around those parts. And for the most part, all my trips out into the wilderness, including my solo ones, went perfectly fine. But then there was this one trip that I made back in the summer of 1995 that I'll never forget, and the reason that I'm writing you. I used to do a bunch of different things as a trail guide, not just guide people, and one of my favorites was what amounted to a sort of campsite scouting. We'd host a lot of overnight camping trips, mostly for younger or older folks, so we needed tried and tested places to take our guests. For example, you needed a piece of flat, solid ground large enough for at least 4 or 5 tents. It couldn't be in a low spot either, where rain could pool up and turn your site into a swamp after one of those quick Ouachita storms. The ground had to be nice and clear, with no overhead widowmakers either, and by that I mean dead branches or leaning trees that could crash down in a wind gust. And seeing as we were in bear country, scanning for scat, tracks, or fresh diggings were more important too, and if a place seemed active, I just moved on, because a bear encounter was not something I was willing to risk. And then once you had a spot close to water with a place for a good fire pit, it was marked on the map before being field tested, as it were. And that field testing involved one of us heading out to the proposed site and staying there overnight. On the occasion that I'm about to speak on, I was asked to check out a potential campsite around the area called He Creek. He Creek was a runoff of the Mountain Fork River and was about an 8 to 9 hour hike from where we were based. We didn't have many campsites in that area, and I agreed that we could find better ones that we already had, especially in a place with intersecting bodies of water and such varied topography. And it took me all day to get out there, and that's after hitting the trails at 7 a.m., but once I arrived, I soon found a sweet little vacation on a rise but flat peninsula which overlooked the river. It was perfect for fishing and hunting, and ideal for families with kids too, since the creek was ankle deep and the river moved nice and slow. And the only thing left to do was set up my little one-man tent, get a fire going, and see what the night brought me. I hadn't seen any bear or cougar scat, which was a big plus, but out in the wilds of southeast Oklahoma, it's not just the obvious creatures that you gotta be wary of. We've been known to get an alligator or two in the marshier regions of the southeast, and while bobcats and coyotes can be a treat to small children, rampaging herds of feral hogs pose a danger to just about anything that gets in their way, large vehicles included. And so the whole idea of staying out there overnight is to get a real feel for the place, since it's at night when the wilds really come alive. And after easily putting together a campfire, thanks to the abundance of firewood in the area, I made myself a campfire dinner and then took to reading some Call of the Wild by Headlamp. I'd read it before, but I figured that there was no better paperback for a night in the wilderness, and I'd just gotten to one of my favorite passages. Quote, "He was beaten, but he was not broken," etc., when I heard a noise about 20 to 30 yards away through the trees. I don't spook easily, and I spent enough nights outdoors to know nights can be noisy, so since all you normally need to do with an animal is let them know that you're there, all I said was, "Howdy, y'all," as I looked up from my book. Now, I didn't hear any more movement after that, for a couple of minutes anyway, so I figured maybe it was just a dead branch falling from a tree. But it wasn't long before I heard it again, and that time, it was even closer. Someone or something was moving through the darkness, getting closer and closer to me with each passing minute. And so I did what any other right-minded person might do in that situation, and I reached for my gun. Now, I carried a Super Red Hawk, but in a .480 Ruger, so I had a little less recoil. Now, it was very much my choice sidearm for those oh crap moments, so I was confident that I could put down whatever charged at me. My only worry was that it wasn't an animal, and whoever was out there was similarly armed as myself. So in the off chance that that was the case, I remembered saying, "You gotta be real brave or real stupid to be sneaking up on someone who's camping after dark." Now, it served as a dual purpose, making it clear to an animal that I wasn't going anywhere, and clear to a person that I wasn't some pushover. And then when I heard the sound again just beyond the light of my campfire, sounding like it was coming from behind a nearby tree, I cocked the hammer of my Red Hawk and aimed for its trunk. My hands were shaking as I tried my best to focus on getting my breathing right, so when whatever it was came around the tree trunk, I was ready for it. But then, just as I managed to get my heart rate just a little less frantic, I heard the sound of fast-moving footsteps just off to my right. Whoever it was so fast that I didn't even have time to turn and aim at him, not without giving him a clear shot at me with whatever kind of blade he was holding. I didn't get a good look at it, but I saw it shining in the firelight as it came at me, and it gave me no choice but to basically dive over my own tent in order to put something between us. I heard him yell something as he took a single swing at me, and then by the time I was up on one knee, I only saw the back of him lit up by the campfire as he ran off into the trees again, and I wasn't about to let him get away. So I aimed, steadied myself, and then took a single Hail Mary shot at him. And that bang was so loud it had my ears ringing, and I hoped to hear him scream before tumbling into the dirt, but there was nothing. Just the faint sound of heavy footsteps as whoever it was fleeing the area. I spent the rest of that night watching my own campsite from a distance, just watching and waiting for whoever attacked me to return. Packing up and heading back wasn't really an option, as it'd give whoever was out there a really good opportunity to track my movement on account of how noisy moving around at night can be. But it also raises the question of how the hell did that person manage to approach my camp so quietly, and why the heck would a person try and murder a complete stranger like that in the middle of a wilderness area? At dawn, once it was light enough to see, I walked off in the direction my attacker had run following the encounter and quickly found a trail of blood. I followed it for quite a distance, moving slowly and quietly with my pistol at the ready until I reached a small, chest-height cave set into a rock face. It went deep, but I only went in for enough to see where the blood trail ended, and there were all kinds of animal bones in there. Random pieces of camping trash too, like empty cans and plastic water bottles. But unless they were hiding at the very rear of the cave, seeing my flashlight and keeping quiet as a mouse, I don't figure anyone was in there at that time. I got back to the compound about 9 hours later in the mid-afternoon. I went straight to my boss, told him what happened, and that's why they stopped taking camping parties up near He Creek. The local sheriff said that he'd keep an ear to the ground and I was well within my right to shoot at him, but in all likelihood, they probably wouldn't find the guy with so little to go on. Now, I'm not sure if they found the blood trail and took a sample or whatever they might do. Hell, I'm not even sure they sent anyone out there at all, really. But it just goes to show you that even when you're out there in the middle of nowhere, it's not just the bears you gotta worry about. It's the men. I grew up in Fond du Lac, Wisconsin, but I drifted out west in my teens, ended up getting hooked on heroin, and then spent a little time in federal prison for something I'm not too proud of. Probably goes without saying, but that was rock bottom for me. I made it through without taking any kind of beating, but when I got out, I knew I had to get myself together. For the first time in my life, I had to think about what I wanted to do with myself. I knew I liked being outside, even more so after my stretch in prison, but I knew the chances of me becoming a park or forest ranger as a felon were slim to none. I knew I could try out to be one of those wilderness firefighters because they allow felons to apply if their convictions weren't for violent crimes. But then after stopping at a bar for a couple of beers one Thursday night, I ended up talking to a guy whose cousin operated a tour company out in the Pasayten wilderness. I told him my story over those couple of beers, all the honest-to-God's truth too, no bullcrap. And when I was done, he asked if I was interested in being a tour guide. And then since it involved walking the trails all day, sometimes even camping out overnight, I only had 2 words for him: hell and yes. I got a call the next day from my future boss asking if I was okay interning for a couple of months so I could prove that I was on the level. He'd give me a place to stay, make sure I was fed, watered, and washed, but while he didn't mind taking a chance on me, he didn't want to pay for the privilege. I didn't tell him this, but at the time, I think I'd have happily worked for a whole year for free if it meant having my dream job at the end of it. So I accepted his offer, and then made my way to a small town up in the hills called Barron. I honestly had no idea what to expect, but when I arrived, I found the place was way more comfortable than I ever expected. There were 4 other guides staying up there, not including the boss who lived down in Wilthrop, and they each shared a cabin that had full amenities. There were 3 of them, so I got one all to myself for a while. I knew it was only because the other guides didn't trust me, and probably because the boss had warned them that I was an ex-con. But they were nice enough, so I didn't mind having to earn their trust and respect over time. I really didn't know what to expect from the clientele either, but they proved to be a real mixed bag. You'd get your tourists and your adventure vacation types, who you're only there to make sure that they didn't get lost or wander anywhere they shouldn't. And then there were the corporate team builders or the bachelor parties who were more party than peace. And I fell into the rhythm of that place pretty quickly and started making friends pretty quickly too once people saw how serious I was about it. And then once my trial period was up and I was a fully trained and fully paid up member of the guiding team, I was able to head out with parties all on my own and sometimes for a night or 2 of camping. And that's how I ended up meeting a family of 4 headed up by an older lady named Patty. Patty and her husband must have been in their 60s, maybe early 70s, and they had their 2 grown-up kids with them. They decided to spend a little time in the great outdoors together on account of raising their 2 grown-up kids on concrete, and right away, I could tell that they were going to be great guests. They were just about as wholesome a family unit as it was possible to get, at least in my opinion anyway. They clearly loved each other very much, but they were real funny too. And the way they went at it with each other had me laughing along with them. They were interesting folks too and had some amazing stories to share, so it was one of those parties that was such a pleasure to guide that if I was a millionaire, I would have happily guided them for free. And so we hiked all day, stopped for breaks here and there, until we reached our campsite for the night. I got us a fire going with the help of Patty's grown-up son, then she insisted on doing all the campfire cooking so I could relax and take a load off. We had 2 tents with us, one for the parents, one for the kids, and a reminder that they are grown-up people, and then my small one-man pup tent. We got them all set up, went over a few emergency procedures in case anything happened in the night, and then each went to our sleeping bags for the evening. But what I didn't know, what I could never have known, was just how wrong things were going to go for us during the next day's hike. I remember waking up to the sound of voices and being blinded by flashlights when I looked out of my tent. There, standing outside their tents in what amounted to their nighttime wear, were Patty's husband, son, and daughter, but there was no Patty anywhere to be seen. The 3 of them were whispering at first, but when they heard me asking what was going on, they told me that Patty was missing. Her husband said that he woke up to noises beside him in the tent, but figured his wife was just rolling over in her sleep or something. And then when he asked if she was okay and he didn't hear any reply, he realized that not only was the tent's front flap unzipped, but his wife was nowhere to be seen. Patty's husband then takes a walk around outside for her just to make sure that she really is off taking a leak somewhere. And then when a couple of minutes went by and she hadn't returned, he woke up his kids. And that's when they realized that Patty hadn't even put her shoes on. We briefly discussed the procedure for someone going missing, And so after a quick reminder, we each walked off in a different compass direction with our flashlights and then started yelling out Patty's name. We kept each other's flashlights in view and we didn't go too far, but we kept on yelling her name as loud as we could. And when we didn't get any response, we kept on pushing outwards a little more until we were maybe 100 meters apart on all sides. We yelled and kept on yelling, but still didn't hear a thing from Patty in response. And since I didn't want anyone wandering off and getting lost, I called out for everyone to return to camp. I planned on contacting the local rangers and enlisting their help while I got the family back to headquarters, but Patty's son didn't like that idea at all. A small argument broke out between myself and the son, who insisted that we stay and keep on looking. Now, she was an older lady, so she couldn't have gotten far, I think, and while I agreed, we had certain protocols to follow in the event of someone going missing like that, and those protocols were based on keeping everyone else in a group safe. Yet Patty's husband agreed with their son and insisted that they stay at the camp and keep calling out her name in case she got lost, and so she could find her way back to the camp. I had to work with them. I had to at least give them some hope in that respect, and honestly, because that's the exact same thing I hoped someone might do for me if that was my mom out there lost in the dark forest. And so, while I started to pack up our stuff, I told Patty's son that I wouldn't stop him if he wanted to take one last look around the perimeter. And as you can imagine, he was grateful for my cooperation, but I also get the feeling that he'd have punched me right in the face if I had insisted on leaving. And so off he went, him and his dad, while I tried my best to keep Patty's daughter calm as I packed away my gear and got a start on the group stuff too. I didn't think they'd find anything. I mean, I hope they did, but the wilderness makes you a cynic over time on account of how cruel nature can truly be. And so imagine how surprised and relieved I was when, maybe 10 minutes after they left, I heard the sound of the son's voice coming through the trees as he yelled, "We got her." Patty's daughter burst into tears when she saw her dad and brother approaching with their mom in tow, and I'm not ashamed to say that I wasn't far from tears myself by that point. I'd never had to deal with anything like that before, so to have it over and done with so quickly was an incredible relief. Patty seemed really shaken as we checked her over for injuries, and while her son kept asking what happened, where did you go, she didn't seem to have an answer for them. When she did talk, she just kept saying, "I don't know. I can't remember. I think I got lost." And that all kind of made sense to me once I realized that she'd walked off without a flashlight, because it gets so oppressively dark at night out in the wilderness that it can get really disorienting and frightening very quickly. And I remember telling everyone not to worry, that Patty would probably be more articulate once she'd gotten some sleep and some food, and we were all pretty exhausted by that point. But even after a few hours of sleep and some protein bars and coffee for breakfast, things continued to get worse. To stay on schedule, we could only get a couple of more hours of sleep before we had to wake up, pack up, and make our way back to HQ. And that meant that we were all kind of tired and cranky waking up at 6:30 a.m., but still super relieved that we'd found Patty and avoided any major disasters. I made that coffee, handed out those bars, and while I did, I noticed that Patty was still unusually quiet, especially in comparison to what a chatty Patty she was the day before. I didn't press her too much on it. I just asked if she was feeling okay and was good to walk back to base, and she said sure after apologizing for scaring us. She seemed like her usual self, or at least the usual self that I'd come to know in those 24 hours, but there was something, I don't know, missing. Like she was still a little confused or spooked regarding what had happened that night. And like I said, I didn't press her on it, as I figured that she was probably dealing with a lot of mixed emotions at that point. But as we got back to the trail and started heading back to HQ, Patty's behavior took a series of dramatic turns, and very much for the worst. I think we were maybe 20 minutes into the hike, and it was a nice quiet morning too, so you could hear a pin drop whenever the birds weren't tweeting. Now I'm leading the group. The two grown-up kids are behind me while Patty and her husband are at the rear, and I could hear them whispering to each other, not to keep secrets or anything, just to preserve that early morning calm. But then at one point, I hear Patty's husband say something like, "What did you say? In fact, you know what? Don't. We'll talk about this later." Now, he didn't raise his voice or anything, he just sounded irritated, and since it's my general policy not to intervene until tempers start to flare too badly, I didn't even acknowledge what was said. It's not entirely unusual for folks to get a little snippy with each other, especially when they're tired and out of their comfort zones, and generally speaking, the best course of action is to not escalate, i.e. don't get involved. Little tips like that generally smooth themselves out, as no one wants to have a big family or inter-friend argument in front of the trail guide. But not in this case, not at all. It must have only been a couple of minutes later that I heard Patty's husband behind me say something like, "I told you, Patty, this is not the time. We can talk about this later." To which she replied, and these were her exact words, "We'll talk about it, and then we'll go running off into the arms of one of your whores." Now, both her grown-up kids gasped and were like, "Mom? What the hell?" Now, I felt the exact same way, having seen this sweet old lady go from a ray of sunshine the day before to having a mouth like a damned sewer rat the day after. I mean, that probably sounds a little rich coming from someone who curses up a storm every now and then, but my point stands. Something about Patty was way different. And even with all that crap I've been through in my life, I found the change to be very unsettling. She started off on some rant about how her husband wasn't faithful, how he hadn't been so for years, and he thought that she was dumb for not knowing, but she knew. I remember the husband snapping at her and then yelling, "Patty, I told you, this is not the time." And that silenced her. And I turned to tell them all very politely to just keep moving as fast as they could so we could get them back to base on schedule. I remember turning around and walking backwards while I said it, and considering what she just said, I expected Patty to have a face like thunder. Only she didn't. Quite the opposite, actually. She was sort of smiling, ear to ear. And that was the point where I turned to Patty's son and asked him to drop back a little so I could talk with him in private. And then with his sister now at the lead, we dropped back a ways behind his parents and got to talking. Now, he was understandably on edge, but even more so that we talked because I told him strange turns in behavior like that could be caused by some pretty serious head injuries. And he knew that all too well himself, as I think he was some kind of personal injury specialist, but here's the stickler. Patty didn't show any sign whatsoever of having any kind of head injury. We checked her pretty much all over the night before, especially her scalp, because her hair does a real good job of hiding bumps, cuts, and bruises, especially when those cuts aren't bleeding particularly heavy. But like I said, there was nothing, not even so much as a bump on her head. That didn't mean that she'd taken some kind of fall, but regardless, she needed to be taken to a hospital and checked out for anything that we might have missed. He agreed, and then said the first thing that they'd do once we got back to HQ was drive her to the nearest hospital. But as it turned out, we didn't make it back there at all. As we kept on hiking, Patty started getting very snippy and mean again, but this time it was directed at her kids. Now, I couldn't believe my damn ears as some of the stuff that she was saying. Now, it sounded like she was dragging up age-old fights and wrongdoings, but then from the reaction of her kids, she was putting a particularly venomous and untrue spin on things. Such as one point she accused her son of selling pot in college, and he just about exploded, saying something along the lines of, "No, I did not. I got high like one time, Mom. One time. I could be disbarred if people heard you talking about this." Now, she said something really mean to her daughter too, but I'm not sure that I could say what that was without, if this ever makes it to a video on YouTube, it might get nuked, you know? And I mean, it's not even worth typing out for you to decide which part needs to be removed, because all of it was about as poisonous as you could possibly imagine. I mean, imagine the worst stuff you could ever accuse a woman of, and that's what Patty's mom was accusing her daughter of. It was so bad that the daughter burst into tears as she asked her why she was acting the way she was, and then just kept going on like that until Patty's husband yelled at her to shut the hell up. It all got so bad that I had to step in and ask them to calm down, and I never do that unless things get really, really bad. The daughter was in tears, the son looked next to traumatized, and Patty's husband had turned so red that he looked like a tomato in hiking gear. But Patty, you guessed it, she's just there smiling ear to ear, like what she'd said and the reactions it had gotten was the most amusing and satisfying thing in the world to her. Now, I was so alarmed by it that I asked her, very nice and polite, if she could just refrain from starting arguments until I'd at least gotten them safely back. Now, most folks don't want to argue in front of their guide, and they tend to treat me as a kind of neutral party too. But on this occasion, that formerly sweet old lady looked me dead in the eyes, told me to shut the F up before she got her husband to knock my teeth out. Well, everything exploded again. The daughter cried, the son comforted her, and the husband started really roaring at Patty, asking what the hell had gotten into her that she'd say something like that. Now, he turned to me and said, "I'll do nothing like that, Devin, rest assured." But then turned back to Patty and started screaming at her again. And I had to seriously step in that time and ask everyone to just calm down before things escalated even further. I didn't even know what the escalation might even look like. I just knew that I didn't want to see it. But I don't think I've ever expected things to happen the way they did, because after another period of silence, after calming everyone down, I was at the lead when I heard Patty's husband scream my name. I turned around to see her with a rock in her hand, a big one, and from the looks of things, she was trying to smash her husband in the face with it. Everyone jumped up in to stop it, as in me, the son, and the daughter, while Patty's husband looked so shocked that his face turned from that deep red to an almost bright pale white instantly. Her son grabbed her, her daughter pulled the rock out of her hand, and then they actually took her down to the ground as really carefully and gently as they could, which in fairness wasn't all that gentle considering that she was kicking and flailing and even trying to bite them at one point. I told Patty's husband to just keep her where she was, no matter what. Don't let her run off into the woods and get lost again. He was really shaken, but assured me that she wasn't going anywhere, and neither were they. And so after dropping my pack and telling them that I'd return as quickly as possible, I ran off in the direction of headquarters, keeping a steady jogging pace until I arrived back maybe 20 to 25 minutes later. I felt ready to puke up my own lungs by the time I stopped running, and I had to spend maybe a minute catching my breath before I could actually describe the situation that was happening back on the trail. We had an ATV with a Medlight transport trailer attached, which are those gurney things that you see attached to them so injured people can be moved around off-road. And so after a coworker grabbed the keys, I rode back to where Patty and her family were. I was terrified things had gotten even worse in my absence, but while things seemed to have calmed down a little, Patty's condition hadn't improved any. It had actually gotten worse. She was still in the ground when we arrived, but she wasn't being restrained by her kids anymore. Instead, she looked exhausted, and there was a little puddle of puke nearby where she'd been vomiting. All that venom seemed to have left her, too, because when I asked her if she was awake, all she'd say was, "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. I don't know what happened." And that was all perfectly normal sounding, to go up and down like that, I mean. They call them mood swings for a reason, right? And that only further convinced me that Patty was suffering the effects of some kind of head injury that we didn't know about. But then Patty's son took me aside, and with a sort of scared look on his face, he says, "I think she's losing her mind, man." Now, I reassured him that that probably wasn't what was happening, and that people don't just lose their minds like that after getting lost in the woods for a brief period of time. But he still needed to rush her to a hospital once they were able to do so, and with that, he agreed wholeheartedly. But he did say something that frightened me too, and that was how she hadn't responded when he called her Mom. Patty's son described how after asking her something along the lines of, "Mom, are you feeling any better?" she acted like she was ignoring him. And he got kind of mad and then says, "Don't just ignore me, Mom." But then she looked at him from where she was laying with this very confused look on her face. And it was like he had to remind her that's who she was to him, his mom, and after that she just kept apologizing and saying she could remember where she was. And even now I find all that very confusing because while that's all still consistent with someone receiving a major head injury, an injury like that would not have been difficult to detect. So the fact that there was no blood in her hair from a gash or a big lump where she'd suffer a nasty impact to make her concussed, it made no sense to us at all. Once I told them what happened, everyone back at headquarters agreed that it was best to contact EMS, and then since we were way out in the sticks and Patty's condition seemed really serious, they ended up sending out an air ambulance. Now, I've never seen a helicopter hover so low before, but I didn't exactly have time to enjoy it either. I was scared for Patty, and I felt so terrible for her husband and 2 kids who, as you can imagine, were in a really bad way by the time the helicopter showed up. All I could do was tell them that I'd be praying for them and that our doors were always open to them, and then after they drove off, that was the end of it. We didn't hear anything more about Patty or what happened to her that night on the trail, but we didn't forget it, especially not me. Time went by, but I found myself just thinking about Patty on a daily basis and without fail. Anytime I was out on the trails, especially when the day got close to being done, I'd picture her waking up, climbing out of her tent and just wandering off in the darkness in her bare feet. We could understand her putting her boots on and walking off to go urinate somewhere, but walking off without them seemed to suggest that she was either really scared of something or just wanted to run, or she was in some kind of trance. Now, they call it a fugue state in psychology. You may have heard of it, and me and the other guides have talked about it at length. It's rare as hell, but every so often, someone's mind stays asleep while their bodies just keep moving, like there's someone or something else at the wheel, like sleepwalking. And that's kind of what we think happened to Patty. That maybe she fell and bashed her head, and that's what brought her out of it. But all we had were guesses and theories, and none of us wanted to contact Patty's family out of respect for their privacy. I hoped that maybe they'd call one day and let us know how she was. But why would they? I was just the trail guide, and by the looks of things, they had way bigger fish to fry than checking in with me. I just wish I knew what happened to that poor lady, because sometimes thinking about that just scares the hell out of me. I'd been working as a wilderness guide out near Mount Shasta for about 3 months when I first met Noah. I'd moved to California from Minnesota, so I didn't really know anyone outside of my coworkers. And since the town is mostly a lot of tourists, I'd have to drive down to Redding to find people that weren't just working or passing through. And that's how I met Noah and her friends while hanging out and watching the Vikings at a bar. She was nice and really pretty too, with those deep brown eyes that she said came from the Italian side of her family. We swapped phone numbers, went for some coffee and drinks a few times, and then when things started getting a little more serious, coffee and drinks turned into longer and less public meetings. Noah thought it was cool that I got to work with nature, but it never occurred to me to turn a trail hike into a date. She lived down in Redding, and I preferred heading down there since she had a nicer apartment and a cat. And there was also way more to do down there, so in the end, it was Noah who asked me if she could drive up to Shasta sometime to check out the trails that I worked. Now, I thought it sounded like a great idea, and like I said, I was kind of kicking myself for not thinking of it sooner. She was super into nature, and so I could impress her with all of my accumulated knowledge, and it'd be cute to spend some time out there alone instead of surrounded by other people down in the city. She drove up to Shasta in the morning, and then after spending some time putting a little picnic together, we drove out to the trailhead near the upper sand flats and then hiked into the woods from there. The first thing I told her about, because the ladies always love this one, is how old-timey prospectors used to keep ringtails as pets. A ringtail is a small rodent, kind of like a cross between a fox and a squirrel. They're very cute, and I strongly recommend that you Google them to see just how cute they are. But the miners didn't keep them around because they were cute. Oh no. They called them miners' cats because they were great at scaring off the rats that tried making their homes among the camp. I talked about how wolves had been reintroduced into the area and how it stabilized the deer population. Then I remember mentioning the prairie falcons and how they reached speeds of 200 miles per hour when they're dive-bombing prey. But one of my favorite little factoids, and one Noah loved too, was a behavior in black-tailed deer that we call flagging. And just like their name suggests, black-tailed deer have black tails, but only on the tops and sides. The undersides of the tails is the same color as their butts, a sort of off-white, and when they detect a potential threat in the area, their tails shoot up to show the white and then not the black side. And it's kind of like a collective traffic light, something that says ready, steady before the go when the threat proves significant, and it's just one of many examples of how animals have developed methods of wordless communication. Now we walked for a few miles, with me dropping the aforementioned facts here and there, and then when we stopped for our picnic, I told Noah how Mount Shasta has its share of carnivorous plants, like the California pitcher. I also told her how growers have been trying to introduce the matsutake mushroom to the region, which is highly prized in Japanese cuisine. The only thing is, it can take up to a century for the fungus to form the symbiotic relationships with the pine trees that allow them to mature before fruiting. And that means that people trying to introduce will probably never even live to see the fruits of their labors. They're doing it entirely for the next generation, and we agreed that there was something very beautiful about that. And I remember at one point, Noah, who was having a great time, said something along the lines of, "Oh man, my dad would love this. We should totally bring him up here sometime." Now, I went quiet for what felt like the first time on the whole hike because she kind of casually let slip that I was the bring them home to dad type. Now, I was really into her, and so it felt amazing that she saw me that way. And then after pivoting towards family, we spent a little while talking about more personal stuff. Up until that point, it was probably the best date I'd ever been on, talking about something that I was passionate about, but impressing someone that I cared about all the while. But I had no idea at all how wrong things were about to go. And as the sun reached its peak and the day got to its hottest few hours, we were sort of taking on water like nobody's business. And so inevitably it came time for a little bathroom break. We agreed to walk off the trail in different directions, me taking on some trees on the left while she walked up this very steep slope to the right where it leveled off for a little more privacy from the trail. I figured that we'd be separated for a matter of minutes, and I also figured that I'd be done much quicker for reason of mail logistics, so I wasn't alarmed or anything when I got back to the trail and Noah wasn't there. But as the minutes ticked by and Noah still hadn't reappeared, I started to get a little worried. I took a few steps up the slope, not all the way as to impede her privacy, and then I called out her name and asked if she was all good. At the time, I thought I expected to hear her say something back, but I think looking back on it, it was more like hoped, because I remember that feeling of hope turning into this very rising panic when Noah didn't reply. It was dead silent from the top of that rise there, and it worried me so much that I walked to the top to see where Noah was. But when I looked, she was nowhere to be seen. Now, I think I hesitated for a moment looking at all the trees and bushes in front of me because it seemed totally logical that she'd walked off into the trees and out of sight to get her privacy. And it also didn't seem out of the question that she just didn't want to yell back at me because she was in the midst of peeing. I know that might sound dumb, but I was honestly just trying to rationalize the situation and not totally catastrophize it. But then looking back, I was a fool not to trust my instinct and go looking for her, because only seconds after calling out Noah's name a second time, I heard her scream. Now, without thinking, I started running in the direction of that scream before suddenly stopping myself. I dropped my backpack from my shoulders and was just totally frantic as I tore it open and went for the little pouch meant for my .45. I hadn't told Noah that I brought a gun with me. She was really anti-gun, so I didn't want to freak her out by announcing that I was carrying, but I also wasn't about to head out into the trail without a means of actually protecting us, so given the circumstances, you can bet that I was glad that I brought it. And I guess I should also make it clear how just from the sound of Noah's scream, I knew that she hadn't just sprained her ankle. It wasn't a scream of pain. It was a scream of terror, and I wasn't about to square up whatever scared her so badly without protection. I found the gun, and then went running off into the trees while calling out Noah's name. Now, I called out maybe 2 or 3 more times as I was running, but again, got nothing in reply, so I kept on moving through the trees with my head on a swivel, until suddenly, I saw her. Noah was being dragged along the forest floor by her hair, and the person dragging her looked normal. Now, remember this sort of split second thinking, total confusion almost as I locked eyes with the guy dragging her. I guess in my head, this guy should have looked like a monster. I mean, quite literally some big lumbering beast that was hairy and teethy and clawy, you know? But he didn't look like that at all because, like I said, he just sort of looked normal. He had a blue t-shirt on, khaki shorts, and then tan hiking boots with colorful socks sticking out the tops. He looked like your average hiker, Completely unremarkable aside from the fact that he was dragging my date across the ground by the hair. We locked eyes, and in that split second, I could see how scared he was. All I remember thinking was, "Good, you should be scared," and then I aimed that gun at him and screamed at him to let her go. And the guy looked terrified, but he didn't let go of Noah's hair. In fact, after maybe only a split second of him being still, he kept on pulling her like twice as hard. He was obviously trying to get away, but there was no way that he was about to outrun me while trying to drag a human body. The smart thing to do would have been to just let go of her hair and run, but he didn't. He was so fixated on her that he made this laughable, futile attempt to cart her away and escape. I mean, it might actually have been funny if he wasn't dragging Noah by her hair, but he was, so it was this weird combination of insane and horrifying to me. And with the gun still aimed at him, I yelled at him to let Noah go or I'd shoot. The guy stopped again and looked at me with that sort of same scared look in his eyes, and when he didn't let her go, I remember thinking, okay, it's happening. But then as I began to line my sights up on his chest and went to squeeze the trigger, I found that I couldn't actually do it. I felt the cold metal of that trigger on my finger, but right as I was about to pull it, it was like I heard this voice in my head yelling, "Don't do it. You'll hit Noah." And I knew that was possible, but given the relative position of her body to where this guy was standing, it'd have to either be the worst or the unluckiest shot in the history of firearms. I wasn't a bad shot either, like I knew I could have dropped the guy at those kinds of ranges, but like I said, when it came to pulling the trigger, I locked up in a way I never anticipated. And then when I locked up, the fear and doubt started to completely overwhelm me. I was frozen to the spot, not being able to shoot but not daring to lower my gun either, but the worst thing was, the guy could tell. He saw a fear bigger than his own reflected in my eyes, and when he did, I think it calmed him. He didn't smile or laugh or anything sinister like that. He just sort of turned his head to make sure that the way was clear, and then just kept on dragging this now semi-conscious but still weak Noah through the trees. But that spurred me into action. I still couldn't bring myself to take a shot right at him. I was just scared to, I guess. But what I could bring myself to do was warn him. Now, I can already hear all the ultimate badasses in the comments saying, "Oh man, such a pussy, couldn't bring himself to shoot a man to protect his girl." Well, while you might be the super soldier who inspired John Wick, I'm not him. And while you might be so skilled with a pistol that you give yourself prostate exams with them, and I'm sure you do, that's not me. And so the only shot that I knew would be 100% safe was a kind of warning shot above the guy's head, the kind that had absolutely zero chance of hitting either of them, and so that's what I did. I aimed higher and fired a warning shot that flew well above his head, but it was enough to make him jump and turn back to me with this look of absolute terror in his face. I yelled the only thing that came to mind, which was how if he didn't let her go, the next bullet was going to find him. And it was the only remotely badass thing I did during that whole encounter, and I guess it only worked because I needed it to, but it was effective. The guy then let go of Noah's hair, then turned and ran off through the trees. I immediately followed, rushing forward to where Noah was lying. At this point, she was half awake, coming to after having been hit pretty hard in the jaw with something. There was blood coming out of her mouth, her eyes looked like they were struggling to focus, and I had to support her after helping her to her feet. I put her back down again once we got to the trail, and then as she realized where she was and remembered what had happened, she just started crying. Since the cell signal was so shoddy on account of being relatively low altitude, I did the only thing I could do, which was try and console her. She kept going back and forth between apologizing and thanking me, and while I'm not sure what the apologies were for, she certainly didn't have to thank me. I told her it was okay, that the man was gone and he didn't seem to be armed, but that we needed to get her out of there to get her jaw checked at the hospital. We could move at whatever pace she wanted because I had my gun to protect us, but the longer we stayed, the more chance that he'd try and come back to find us. And maybe that time, he'd have something to fire back. We were up and moving again seconds later, at a mixed pace of jogging and walking fast. I think all the heavy breathing brought Noah a kind of calm because before long, she was able to tell me exactly what had happened after we went off to pee. And even all these years later, thinking about it scares the hell out of me. So Noah said that she'd walked off into the trees at the top of the slope and then put enough of them between me and her to ensure that no one peeking up from the trail could get a look at her. She drops her shorts, does her thing, but then as she's buttoning them up again, she hears something moving kind of close to her. She stayed put and stayed quiet, and then when she heard me calling out her name, she was too scared to respond. She said it felt like the thing close to her was hunting her, and calling back to it would have allowed it to find her. But then seconds later, she hears a sort of thud, thud, thud of fast footsteps behind her, and then when she turns to look, bam. The first hit didn't knock her out, and that's when she screamed. The second one knocked her unconscious briefly, but by that time, help was on the way. I was worried that she might have a fractured jaw, maybe some kind of damage to her teeth, but luckily the only wounds were to the inside of Noah's cheek. She had some pretty nasty bruising on her face, and it took a while for the inside of her mouth to heal, but I'd say that she escaped some pretty nasty injuries. And if that guy had gotten her to wherever he wanted her, I'd say that she might have even escaped a fate worse than death, too. We obviously filed a police report at the Shasta Police Department that very same day, right after Noah was discharged from the hospital. It was stressful for her, really stressful, having to kind of relive those events so soon, but we agreed it was better to get it on paper while it was fresh in her mind. We thought it paid off too when the cops told us they'd arrested a guy. But after we drove back to the department and Noah checked out the guy's booking photo, we both agreed it wasn't him. The guy in the photo had a bunch of violent convictions, many of which involved female victims, but as much as we wanted it to be, it wasn't the same guy that attacked Noah. It affected her for a while after. Like she said she had nightmares about seeing the guy's face suddenly in places that she didn't expect it to be. I really felt for her, and I made myself available in every capacity I could. And then, as messed up as it sounds, it was that horrible event that brought us way closer together and put us on the road to where we are today. Me and Noah are still together, coming up on 7 years now, and this year I'm finally going to do the right thing and ask her to marry me. And maybe if you read this on your podcast, it'll be how she finds out what I'm planning, but if not, well, I'm sure I'll think of a way to ask the love of my life to be my lawful wedded wife. And so I can spend the rest of my life protecting her, the same way I did near Mount Shasta that day. Hey friends, thanks so much for listening. Click that notification bell to be alerted of all future narrations. I release new videos every Monday and Thursday at 9 p.m. Eastern Time, and there are super fun live streams on Sundays and Wednesday nights. If you got a story, be sure to submit them over at my email at letsreadsubmissions@gmail.com, and you might even hear your story featured on the next video. And if you want to support me even more, grab early access to all future narrations and bonus content over on Patreon, or click that big join button to hear about the extra perks for members of the channel. And check out the Let's Read podcast, where you can hear all of these stories and big compilations located anywhere you listen to podcasts. I also have a true crime channel called Saturn Soul. All links in the description below. Thanks so much, friends, and I'll see you again soon. In May 1996, 2 young women disappeared into the quiet depths of Virginia's Shenandoah Forest and were later found dead at their secluded campsite, bound and silenced far from any trailhead. What should have been a peaceful hiking trip became a grim mystery whispered among the trees. Hear the full story over on my true crime channel, Saturn Soul, linked down below. Now enjoy the stories. More than 3 decades ago, back when I was a much younger man, I helped a mate of mine move down to Glasgow from our home city of Newcastle. He'd managed to get a job as a football scout for Glasgow Rangers, which was basically his dream career. And so while me and all of our mates were sad to see the back of him, we were all really proud of him too. Now, we drove up early in the morning, and then once everything was unloaded, we had some pub grub and a few loggers, shandies from me, and then I started on the drive back to Newcastle. I'd left it quite late to drive back, so it was about midnight by the time I started to see signs for the English borders. The roads were quiet, with only the occasional lorry thundering past me, and I remember there being some phone-in thing on the radio, but I wasn't really listening. I was in my old Vauxhall Cavalier, an '82 model that I bought on the cheap about 4 years prior. It normally served me well, and it had been running fine all day, but just after passing a place called Jedburgh, the temperature warning light flicked on. I looked at my dash, watching the needle climbing into the red, and swore under my breath as I eased off the accelerator. Since it normally bought me a few minutes, I cranked the heater up full blast to try and pull some heat out of the engine. But that time, it seems my luck finally ran out, because just a minute or so later, there was this loud hiss from under the bonnet before steam started pouring out the seams. Seconds later, I heard this horrible metallic knocking sound coming from under the bonnet, and so I coasted over to the hard shoulder and then came to a stop just in time for the engine to seize up completely. And after that, aside from the ticking of my hazard lights and the sound of hot metal cooling down, there was nothing but silence for a few seconds, until I erupted. I remember shouting, "Are you effing kidding me?" a couple of times, and then, after taking a few deep breaths, I got out of the car and tried to fix it. And I tried it for half an hour, and in that time a grand total of 2 cars passed me, but even with me waving at them as they passed, neither of them stopped. I didn't just stand there like some plonker for the whole 30 minutes, mind you. I popped my bonnet not long after getting out, but when I did, a load of steam and the smell of burnt coolant came wafting up into my face. And after waving away some of the steam, I spotted a crack in the top radiator hose and then noticed how loads of antifreeze was dripping onto the road and forming a big green puddle. I didn't have a spare hose, and neither did I have enough water to top it up properly, and even if I had, the engine had overheated so badly that I didn't trust it not to seize up again. Basically, I wasn't going anywhere in my old Vauxhall, and since there were no mobile phones back then, at least none for the likes of me, I had no choice but to walk if I wanted to get myself some help. Now, I reckon the nearest emergency phone would have been about a mile down the road, maybe more, and so I locked my car, left my hazards flashing, and then started walking along the dark grass verge with a torch in my hand. Now, I thought I'd be on the move for quite a while, but then no sooner had I started walking, I came to a dirt track, previously concealed by a long hedgerow, which led to what looked like a big 3-story farmer's house. Now, I was so happy that I was literally punching the air, because despite the fact that there were no lights switched on the ground floor, there was what looked to be candlelight in both the front-facing upstairs rooms. I felt bad for calling so late, but since the alternative of walking along the motorway was a much more dangerous one, I reckoned that I didn't have much choice. It was a particularly dark night, small moon and cloud cover, so it was only once I got closer to the house that I saw how run down it was. The ground floor windows were either cracked or newspapered over, and there were cracks in the wood too, along with a lot of peeling paint. And as you can imagine, I started to get really bad vibes from the place. But I try not to judge books by their cover too much, because you tend to be rewarded more times than you're burned for it. And so with that in mind, and granted very foolishly, I decided to knock on the door. I didn't knock too loud or aggressively. I didn't want to frighten anyone. But when my first knock got no answer, I knocked a little bit louder. Again, there was complete silence. No footsteps behind the door, no talking inside, nothing. But then after taking a step back and looking up at the top windows, I saw someone peeking out at me from behind a dirty-looking curtain. And I can't lie, it did scare me a bit seeing a pair of eyes staring back at me through the dim light. But as soon as I reacted, the eyes disappeared and I began to hear voices inside the house. Now, it sounded like a fair number of people, maybe half a dozen, and they were whispering like they were talking among themselves. I heard a little voice in my head saying, "They're awake, knock again." But before I could even dismiss it, I heard the sound of someone laughing inside the house. Not loudly, though, more like a muted sort of wheeze as they tried to keep their voice low. The bad vibes that I was getting ramped up to 11, so instead of risking a confrontation with whoever was either living or more likely squatting there, I decided to make a move. I turned around and walked back up the dirt path as fast as I could, looking over my shoulder every so often to make sure that no one was following me. Now, I was quite certain whoever was inside was watching me from those windows, but as long as they didn't follow me, then I didn't mind what they did. I'd almost gotten to the end of the path to where those two wooden gate posts held no gate when I started smelling something strong on the breeze, something that smelled like burning. And then when I turned the corner and could see out onto the road again, I felt this almost involuntary scream jump out of my mouth as I realized what the smell was. It was my car. My car was on fire. Now, I suppose I acted on complete instinct in running over to it because there was absolutely bugger all I could do about putting out that fire. All I could do was just stand there, effing and blinding and looking around for whoever might have done it. But as you can probably guess, there was no one, and the whole area looked deserted. And I knew for a fact that it wasn't. When I realized just how much of a bad situation I truly was in, I started jogging along the road until I got back on the motorway. Now, it was only a 4-lane carriageway, so I could walk along the verge without being in too much danger, but no matter how much danger passing cars posed to me, it still seemed safer than hanging around my burning car in that creepy house. Now, I think probably about a half an hour must have passed with only the odd car going past me, and in that time, I didn't try to get anyone's attention just in case it was the people from the home. I mean, the joke was on them in a sense because that poor cavalier was definitely on her way out, but on the off chance they wanted to do more than just burn my car, I had to be very careful about who I revealed myself to. Now, I was bloody nervous for that first half an hour, but after that, I started to calm down a wee bit. I hadn't seen any cars or anything parked outside the house, and if they really did want to chase me down for whatever reason, I reckoned that I'd have encountered them already. So once I'd calmed down a bit, and after maybe 2 or 3 more cars passed me with me sticking to the trees on the verge, I made my way to the edge of the road and then stuck my thumb out at what looked like a Land Rover of some kind coming my way. Now, it slowed down as the driver saw me, but then instead of switching on the light above the wheel, someone in the passenger seat started shining a torch in my face after lowering their window. And right away, I knew that wasn't promising behavior when I realized whoever was in the car didn't want to be seen, and I turned and started walking away. Now, a second later, I heard a very promising, "Need a lift, pal?" Now, one that was just friendly enough to slow me down and make me think that I might have been overreacting. But then the second I slowed, I turned back to face the car, and the passenger doors opened up and I heard someone shout, "Get him!" Now, I remember running right at the trees at the side of the road. Not along the road where the car would have been able to cut me off, but at and then through the trees and bushes at the side of the road. I remember closing my eyes as I felt things scratching against my face, and then when I opened them, I found that I'd come to a fence on the other side. I hopped over it with speed and power that I didn't even know I had in me. I mean, I was hardly some couch potato back then, but I wasn't exactly in perfect shape either. But I swear, I think I vaulted that fence like an Olympic athlete for fear of what might have happened if those men had caught up with me. It's strange thinking back on it as well, because these days, all I do sometimes is sit and wonder why those people chose to go after me like they did. But in the moment, as I was running, it didn't matter a jot to me. All I knew was that those people were out to get me, and all that mattered in the world was getting away from them in that moment. Now, I ran across this big dark field for what felt like ages, running and running until I couldn't anymore. And then when I got to the other side and spotted a road ahead of me, I swear I saw that same Land Rover driving along the road with someone shining a torch out into the field. I had to change my route and head off at an angle to avoid the Land Rover, and along with anyone to my rear who might have followed me. I had to force myself to run when I didn't think that I could run anymore, and even though I was quite a fit young lad and one pumped full of adrenaline, I soon felt like that I was about to cough up a lung and fall over. In the end, I found myself staggering onto a road and then right back onto another dark field because I was too scared to be out in the open with a car full of blokes trying to find me. I kept on going like that until I came across a small town. And then as I was walking its dark and empty streets, looking for anyone who might be able to help, a police car appeared, and an officer asked what I was doing walking the streets alone like that. When I told him what had happened to me, he told me to jump in the car, and then off we went to the police station for a cup of hot tea and a few biscuits while I went into more detail about what had happened. As soon as I mentioned the house that I'd stopped by and mentioned how there had been people inside, I remember these two officers giving each other a look because they told me that the people inside must have been squatters. I thought that they might have been, partly because of how run down the house was, but the police confirmed that it was derelict and that there shouldn't have been anyone in there. They said that they'd head over and check it out, but they doubted anyone would be there. Squatters are kind of like rats. They're annoying and sometimes they're dangerous, but they're not stupid, and they just move on someplace else and then maybe return when things all blew over. But in all likelihood, they were gone from that house for good. I remember asking the two policemen why, as in why had they burned my car before trying to hunt me down like that, and the first words out of the policemen's mouths were, "Well, what did you see?" He was convinced that I'd seen them doing something that they shouldn't have been doing, and after spotting my car, which they assumed was still functional, they tried to make sure that I couldn't get away before chasing me down. But that was the thing. I hadn't seen anything, and once I'd established that, all we could think of was that those squatters just wanted to scare me off. One of the policemen said that since they didn't know who I was, they might have assumed that I was some kind of bailiff or law enforcement agent, and at first they might have been worried that I was a policeman, but then when they realized that I wasn't, they must have reckoned that I was fair game for a kicking. And if only to make sure that I was too scared to return. And with nothing else to say, I gave the police the phone number for my flat in Newcastle, and then since I literally lost everything but my wallet, one of them was kind enough to give me a lift to a nearby train station. It was long past dawn by then, so the trains were running, and I didn't have to wait long before I was on my way back to Newcastle. They phoned a few days later saying that that house was empty, and there wasn't much in the way of evidence tying anyone to the arson. They promised to keep their ears to the ground and would let me know immediately if there was any progress, but till then, they advised me to be patient because things like that took time. Sadly, that was the last I heard from the police, marking the end of my first encounter with squatters, and hopefully my last, too. I had no idea that those people could be so violent. I mean, call me naive, but the squatters I was familiar with were the hippies who took over empty houses in London in the 60s. I thought that they'd be more into peace protests and drum circles than chasing down strangers. But I suppose times had changed then, and people changed with them. Almost 10 years ago now, way back in September of 2016, I drove all the way from LA to Phoenix to visit an old high school friend. Now, I was 31 and female, but still Hispanic and still small, and I drove out on a Friday and we spent all day Saturday together. And then, even though I planned to drive back home in the mid-afternoon on Sunday, I didn't end up leaving until about 9 p.m. at night. Now I know, I should have left earlier, and I know what I'm about to tell you is basically my own damned fault for not sticking to my plan. But even so, there are still nights sometimes, even all this time later, when I find myself waking up from nightmares with a cold sweat forming on my chest, having relived it all over again in my sleep. It was just after midnight when I rolled into Riverside County after passing over the Arizona state line. Now, a few people were still up in that area, so it wasn't completely dead, but after I passed the airport and the Mesa Verde complex, the 10 got super quiet again, and it seemed like there was no one but me out there for miles and miles. I was just trying to keep myself awake with some music and by blasting some cold air when suddenly I noticed a pair of headlights in my rear view. Someone was coming up on me, and really fast too, and seeing how fast they were going, I honestly figured it was the police. I didn't panic or anything, I wasn't doing anything wrong, and I didn't have anything in the car that I shouldn't have. And so I just sat tight, kept my speed, and let them get closer and closer. When they got so close their headlights were blinding me if I looked up into the rear view, I figured they'd pass and keep going. But they stayed put, right behind me in the same lane, and didn't budge for at least a couple of minutes. I'm trying to figure out if these guys really are cops, because it looked like they were driving in one of those big sliding door vans. Only this one was all blacked out, like even the windows looked like they were tinted. Now, there was nothing on it to say that they were police, and no lights on the top either, so I started getting really nervous thinking, what the hell do these guys want with me? Like I said, they stayed behind me like that for a couple of minutes, and then by the time they dropped back a little, they sped up to try and pass me, and I was actually super relieved. Now, I thought because they weren't trying to follow anymore, I was out of danger, when in reality, I was in more danger than I could have ever even imagined. I just let them pass, because what the heck was I going to do? But then instead of passing me and speeding off, the black van pulled back into the same lane as me and then started cruising maybe 10 to 15 minutes in front like it was trying to block me. I thought, oh, big deal, right? Like I could just slow down and lose them. But I didn't think that I'd need to, so I didn't. I stayed right where I was, slowing only a little to just a safe distance between us, and then kept on cruising just like the van was. Oh, I had no idea what they were up to, and I think maybe curiosity really did almost kill the cat here, because when the van's rear doors swung open, and I saw a man in leathers with some kind of bandana wrapped around his face, I kind of just froze up. I couldn't think of a single good reason why he'd want to open the back doors like that, and for a second I thought that he might be planning on jumping out for some reason. I don't know what I was thinking. All I did was lean on the brake a little and put just a little more feet between myself and that van. I just had no idea that I'd moved right where he wanted me. I dropped back a little more, still wondering what the hell these guys were doing and why they didn't have any plates on the back of their van. I then watched as the man with the bandana around his mouth began to smile at me. I obviously couldn't see his mouth, but I could see it in his eyes. That or the dust was getting to him, because it's like he squinted before turning his back on me and carefully leaning down to grab something. Now, I might sound crazy or dumb to y'all who are reading this back in almost slow-mo, and maybe I was just too tired and slow or naive as heck, but I could not conceive of what he was about to do next, no matter how obvious it seems looking back on it. And so I just watched as the guy hauled something up into his arms, turned around, and then tossed it out onto the freeway in front of him. I saw what it was way too late, and I guess that moment of panic really did slow me down, but I had just enough in me to turn the wheel at just the right moment, so that when that old engine block came bouncing up off the blacktop, it smashed into my windshield on the passenger side and not into me. And once it hit, instinct told me to slam on the brakes, and so that's what I did, bringing my car to a spinning, screeching stop. Before I realized that I was covered in glass and there was basically a giant gaping hole where my windshield used to be. I just remember sitting there and shaking after I turned off my engine, and then I got out, walked to the side of the highway with my phone and dialed 911. And it wasn't until I described exactly what had happened as calmly as I could that I suddenly just broke down when the operator told me to stay on the line while she transferred me to someone. And after that, it was a case of guiding the cops and EMS to where I was so I could be taken to the ER. Aside from a few cuts and some mild whiplash, I was pretty much good to go, but I was reminded of just how lucky I'd been by that doctor. The cops had said the same thing, and that's why I say reminded, but at the time it didn't all the way feel lucky, and it wouldn't for quite some time. I knew I was lucky to be alive, and it wasn't like I was completely blind to how lucky I'd been in that respect, but all I could think about in the months afterwards was, why me? Like, why did they pick me of all the people they could have picked to throw a damn engine at? Like, I know they were trying to kill me. I just want to know what it was about me that made them think, yeah, this is the one. Let's turn her into hamburger meat. The cops didn't find that van or the people inside it, and I don't mean any disrespect to the boys in blue when I say this, but I didn't have much faith that they would. It was a black van, no plates, traveling in the middle of the damn night in the middle of the damn desert, and it might as well have been a ghost. And that fits too, because you know something? It sure as heck haunts me like one. More than 20 years ago now, back when my son James was still in elementary school, we took a trip down to Bethesda, Maryland from New York so he could see his grandma. Now, it was kind of messed up from the start, I guess, because I had something come up at work on the Friday we planned to leave. And this meant that I couldn't get on the road until about 8:30 in the evening, meaning I wouldn't arrive in Bethesda till after midnight at the latest. Now, I called ahead to my mom and made sure that was all okay, and she wasn't happy at having less time with her grandson, but there really wasn't much that could be done. And so after getting her to agree to stay up later than usual, me and James hit the road. About 2 hours into the journey, I stopped at a little gas station in Maryland when I realized I needed a coffee and a bite to eat. James was asleep in the back seat, and I was worried about waking him up as I shut my car door. But he was still at that age where when he was out, and his eyes stayed closed after I shut the door. I got one of those big, super strong gas station coffees, a soda for James, and then a bag of those mini powdered donuts because I knew all that sugar would push me through the rest of the way. And then after walking back to my car, I found James was awake. And thinking that shutting my car door really had woken him up, I apologized and then turned in my seat to hand him his drink. And that's when I saw the key ring that he was now holding. At first glance, it looked like a little clown holding a sign of some description, and I asked him what it was while taking a look at it and saw how the clown's little sign read, "Flying Plow Circus." It wasn't plastic either, like it was mass-produced. It was wooden and looked almost handmade. And when I asked James where he got it, he said a man had given it to him. Now, naturally, this didn't ring any alarm bells at first, and I was about to just let it go. But then I asked when the man gave it to him, to which James replied, "A minute ago, while you were in the store." Again, this didn't scare me like it should have, because I'd locked my door. Now, I'd never leave my kid in an unlocked car like that while I went into a store, and since sleepy 6-year-olds aren't the most reliable and frequently play pretend, I didn't really take them seriously. But that's when James said something along the lines of, "Yeah, he did something funny to the door, like, then it opened, then he told us to go visit sometime." Now, I remember my pulse getting faster as I asked James if he was serious, and if he was sure. He told me he wasn't lying, and that the man used some kind of wire to open the door. Now, by the time he said that, my heart felt like it was about to burst out of my chest. I asked what the guy looked like, and James just said, "Normal." And then as I got out of my car and looked around the parking lot, I don't think I'd ever been so close to a panic attack in my whole life. I tried to calm myself down as best I could, and then I asked James to tell me the whole story again from start to finish. He was starting to pick up on my vibe, so he was starting to get all confused and kind of upset, and I had to assure him that he hadn't done anything wrong and that he just needed to tell me what happened, and then he went over it with me a second time. It made my skin crawl to think about, and it still does. The thought of some creep watching people, waiting for an opportunity to break into someone's car so they could creep on their kid. Like, I know all the guy did was give James a key ring, but that's his cover story, right? All he's doing is giving the kid a key ring till the parents take too long coming back, and then it's diddling or abduction time. I asked James if he said or did anything weird, or if he acted in a weird or creepy way, and James said the only weird thing he said was, "Your dad knows me." And even though he was 6, he was skeptical seeing that we didn't even live there. I was freaked out, y'all. The idea of what might have happened scared the hell out of me, but once I saw that there was no one around for me to blame, that fear turned to frustration and then straight up anger. I think if James had pointed someone out like that's him, I'd have straight up torched that dude, and I'd be writing this from prison or something. Not that a jury in their mother effing land would convict me of something like that, but you see my point. I told James to hand me the key ring, and then told him if anything like that ever happened again, he should yell for me, as loud as he could, and he wasn't to stop until I'd appeared to protect him. I told him he'd been very brave and he hadn't done anything wrong, and then gave him the speech on how not everyone who acts friendly wants to be friends. And then once all that was said and done and my heart rate had returned to normal, sort of, we got back on the road again. I remembered the name of the road that I was on a couple of minutes later because I looked it up later when I decided to call the cops. It was called Conowingo Road, a name I don't think I'll ever forget because I was driving down and I saw the sign saying Flying Plow Circus 1 mile ahead. I remember how the rage boiled up in me like you wouldn't believe, and I actually put my foot down thinking, I'm going to give these a-holes a piece of my mind. I powered along the highway, probably dipping over the speed limit a couple of times, till I finally found the sign saying Flying Plow Circus next right. I don't know exactly what I was planning. Maybe just find where the carnies' trailers were, then curse up a storm on how they needed to keep a leash on their pedo co-workers before he gets himself shot. I wasn't dumb enough to start a fight with a whole bunch of random circus folk, and I wasn't about to let their buddy get away with what he did either. But then after making the turn and driving down this dark dirt road to where a circle of trailers were sat, I changed my mind completely. If I could describe that collection of trailers in 2 words, those 2 words would be horror and movie. And there was a fire in the middle of them and a bunch of people gathered around it. And then when they saw my car, I saw a couple of them turn to look at me. I couldn't make much out. They were just these dark shapes with the fire in the background, but that made them even creepier looking. I realized that it might not be a case of one rogue carny, and for all I know, the whole gang might have sent that one guy out looking for a kid to snatch and bring back to them. Now I just kept on watching them, watching me for maybe half a minute more, and then after taking one look at James in the back, who by then had fallen back asleep, I thought, screw this, and then turned around and drove off. Now before James was born, if something like that happened where someone made me mad enough to hunt them down, then yeah, maybe I'd have gotten my car and been dumb enough to get my ass kicked by a dozen pissed off carnival folk. But after he was born, it was like I had this safety software installed onto my brain where everything I did sparked the thought of, how is this going to end for me? There was no point trying to defend him from something I wouldn't survive confronting, because being a parent is literally all about living to fight another day. Life's not a game anymore for me. I have to do everything I can to protect my kid, and it's just scary as hell when you try and do all the right things and still end up with some creep breaking into your car. I called the cops from my mom's place that next day after telling her all about the man, the key ring, and all the signs from the Flying Plow Circus. They called me back basically saying that they'd been stonewalled and that no one admitted to slipping out from their camp after dark, not even for a second. And that's what confirmed it for me. If they were just a bunch of innocent, good-natured carnies just making their way in the world, then I doubt that they'd have stonewalled a pair of cops who came around asking about a kitty creeper. If there was some sketchy loner on my crew and I thought that they were up to no good, and I mean really up to no good, I'd want them gone. So the fact that they all sort of said, I don't know what you're talking about, officers, and that made me think that they were in on it and they were just covering for their boy. On the journey back from my mom's and while driving in daylight, I slowed near that turn that I'd seen the trailers on but didn't see any signs for the Flying Plow Circus. Now, I'm guessing that they moved on after the visit from the cops, and after looking it up, I don't think the whole Flying Plow thing was their regular name. Flying Plow something, I can't remember if it was a road or a lane or whatever, was the name of the place that they set up on, so wherever they went, they'd probably put up some new signs and under a new name, and then on they'd go. I don't even know if they were running an actual circus. I saw plenty of trailers, but no big top. But what I do know is that one of them went out looking for kids, and almost certainly for no good reason at all. My name's Hank. I'm a proud Texan, and I work as a bus driver taking folks all over this great state of ours. Most of those journeys take place during the day, but sometimes I like to earn a little extra pay by taking the overnight journeys, or what you might call the red eyes. I fire up that big old rig around dusk, load her up with the sleepy travelers heading either home or away, and then take off along those long, lonely highways that stretch from Houston to El Paso and every place in between. I wouldn't call it a difficult job, but as long as you can keep the wheels turning through the witching hours and dodge all those back road deer, you can almost guarantee everybody gets where they're going safe and sound by sunup. And it's not often the bus causes you problems, because if you keep her clean and well-oiled, and she'll keep you moving and happy. It's the people that complicate things, though. Not every kind of person, but a certain kind, and all the worst rides have been down to that certain kind of person. Including this one, which was probably the worst I have ever experienced. Driving the bus across Texas at night with nothing but country songs and the stars to keep me company, it sometimes makes me feel like a night watchman, one charged with guarding the whole damn state. Now, I meet all kinds of interesting people on that open road under the big Texas sky, and then watching the sun rise over the prairies after a long shift, it's pure gold, but the cons hit hard too. Your sleep schedule gets all turned around, so whenever you're working nights, you miss out double on family dinners and weekends with the kids. The fatigue creeps up on you too, and dealing with rowdy passengers or breakdowns in the middle of nowhere is no picnic. But every so often, you get a special kind of rowdy. The kind that's not just drunk and loud or complaining about fellow passengers' body odor. The kind that's dangerous. Real dangerous. Back during the fall of 2007, I was on a run from Dallas to Austin, driving through the pitch black with nothing but tumbleweeds and truck stops for miles. I had this fella riding with me about 6 rows back, one that had been staring out the window and kind of muttering to himself, at least according to a fellow passenger anyway. I couldn't hear him at first, so it must have been nothing but a few grumbles and not enough to cause a scene. But then after maybe an hour on the road, I started hearing him as he started to raise his voice. I looked up into my mirror to see folks shifting uncomfortably in their seats, but nobody said a word. That happens more often than not. People learn to tune out the oddballs on long bus rides like that, but the guy didn't get any quieter. He only got louder, and as he did, the tension in the air got thicker and thicker. My guy twisted something fierce knowing trouble was simmering, and I just prayed that it'd blow over, sort of like a false alarm, but it didn't. When it came, the guy went off like a firecracker on the 4th of July, almost like his fuse was sizzling away for a while. And then bang, off he went, and there was no stopping him. I heard someone say something to him, I guess a sort of shut up or something to that effect, and the guy replied with a full-throated roar, and then went at that challenger like a freaking skunk pig. I looked back for just a second to see him leaning across the center aisle, lunging at the person I assumed did the back-talking. I had to keep my eyes on the road, but I looked up into the mirror to see fists raining down, and then the sound of passengers screaming along with a doom, doom, doom of the big guy's fists against the other's face. They weren't fighting. It was like a beating. The kind that, if it wasn't stopped, was going to end in a casket and a family dressed in black. The bus exploded into chaos as the beating continued, with some people running for cover toward the rear and others charging the attacker to try and end the assault. And when he realized what was going on, the attacker sort of wheeled around and started swinging on the folks trying to stop him. And let me tell you, this man was no small specimen. From what I could tell, he made short work of the people trying to stop him, and I think he straight up knocked a guy out too, because something freed him up to go back to wailing on the first guy he attacked, who by then was out cold and leaking blood from his nose and mouth. I didn't get a picture of all of this until later, obviously, because I was mostly trying to keep my eyes on the road while keeping an eye on the situation behind me using my driver's mirror. But then as soon as I realized the violence wasn't about to stop anytime soon, I started slowing us down so I could pull us over and get as many people as possible off that bus. I didn't hit the brakes in a sort of screaming tires kind of way. You can't do that on the bus with people standing unless you want them falling head first. And while I didn't mind if our psycho attacker banged his head on an armrest, I had to consider the other passengers too. I brought the bus to the side of the road as fast as I could, which felt painfully slow given what was happening right behind me. And then once we'd come to a stop, I opened up the doors and began hollering for people to get out as quickly as they could. I think I herded about 12 to 14 people out of the front, and there were women clutching their children, a couple of old-timers who couldn't move as fast, but everyone else moved like greased lightning. Everyone except the people trapped on the back of the bus who were being blocked from the front exit by our raging psycho. We had an emergency exit at the back of the bus, so I started yelling at the people in the back to pull the lever and push the door open so they could all scramble out onto the road. I don't know if they just couldn't hear what I was saying over the sound of their screams, or they were too scared to turn their backs on that attacker, but they didn't do as I asked. I kept on yelling louder and louder, but then the psycho turned his attention to me and then came charging down the bus while roaring like some beast. I tried to put something between us, that something being the driver's seat, but as most of you can probably imagine, all he had to do was move a yard to the side and his fists had unfettered access to my face. I felt a couple of punches and kicks, but all I could do was try and shield my head in the hopes that he didn't do any serious damage. At one point, the guy actually grabbed one of my arms by the wrist and pulled it away so he could punch me right in the eye. All it took was one punch, and it felt like I couldn't see out of it anymore, and I knew it'd only take a couple of more of that to do some serious damage. The same pattern played out again, with people trying to get him off of me before being beaten back, and then he turned back to me and started all over again, but he didn't last long because maybe a second or two later all I heard was, "Hey, right here!" It was a young voice, almost sounded a bit like a kid's, and then bam, there was a gunshot, and then I heard that attacker start to groan. I looked around, the vision in my right eye still kind of cloudy, and I saw the attacker was curled up on the floor of the bus near the exit stairs, and he was clutching at his belly with a blood stain getting bigger and bigger on his shirt. Standing over him was this black kid with a gun, and I say kid as he must have been in his late teens, probably early 20s, but there he was, standing over the guy with a smoking pistol, telling him if he tried to get up, he'd blow his head off. With the attacker put down, and with all the fight having left him, the other passengers were able to get off the bus. People were treating the kid with the gun like he was some hero, but all he seemed interested in was getting out of there. I told him to hold his horses because the cops wouldn't arrest a man for defending people like he did, but he turned to me and, with a sort of scared look in his eye, he says, "It ain't legal. It ain't legal, man. I gotta go now." And then off he went. Lord knows where, and that's honestly the last I saw of him. With folks huddled outside in the cold, yes, Texas nights can get cold, I called in what had just happened on my cell and then waited with the rest while they either cried, hugged each other, or just stared into space like I did, wondering how the heck things all went so bad so fast. And not long after, we all saw lights flashing red and blue across the flatlands, and then as they got closer, they were joined by sirens. State troopers rolled up first. Their guns were drawn so they could secure the scene, and then I gave them the lowdown on that berserker. I mentioned the shooter too, and I know I should have been honest with him, and I might have been a little selective over what I remembered because God knows I didn't want that kid's good deed treated like a bad one. Once the cops had the scene secure, the EMTs came right behind them. They hauled off that unconscious fellow with his face all busted up and then stretchered off that young woman too, the one the attacker had given a few hard licks. And they even checked the attacker too, who was still alive but in a lot of pain, and then with him handcuffed to a stretcher, they took him away with a cop sitting in the back of the ambulance with him. The cops questioned everybody, taking statements while I stood there feeling like I'd aged a decade in about an hour. And the company I worked for got a replacement bus out to us as quickly as they could, and then once the dust settled and the authorities cleared us to go, we were back on the road again. We were minus a couple of passengers because some had chosen to wait for kin or friends so they could ride with them instead, but we were also plus one because I got to sit back and enjoy the ride with the new driver at the wheel. The atmosphere on the bus now was pretty dark, with folks whispering to each other about what had just happened. But I preferred the talk because, when it came, the silence was honestly heavier than a lead blanket. I still think about that kid sometimes, the one who shot our attacker before he could do any serious damage to me. I guess if you told me about a guy like that walking around with an illegal gun, I'd have assumed that he was the bad guy. And I guess he sort of was one of the bad guys if he was a felon or what have you. But then all it took was one pull of the trigger at that right moment, and he became kind of a hero to me. I know there's no such thing as a perfect person, but since that night, I've never been so convinced of the existence of flawed heroes. So I used to drive taxis in Liverpool back in the 80s. Now, it was great money for what it was, and so even though I only planned on doing it long enough to find a replacement for the job I'd lost, I ended up driving for almost 3 years before I finally gave up. A big appeal was that I could work when I wanted. If I had something that I needed doing in the daytime, be it something with the kids' school or whatever, I could just take a few hours off, take care of business, and then head out on the jobs again at night to make up the hours. And there was no doing that in a factory or down on the docks, not without getting your pay docked anyway. But it wasn't all sunshine and roses, and I remember one particular job where for a minute or two, it didn't look like I was going to make it home to my family that night. It started when a job came through just after 10 p.m., asking me to take someone from Agberth Vale to Anfield. I got the address, drove over, and then parked up outside a small 2-up, 2-down on a dark and quiet street. I didn't want to beat my horn, which was the usual method of letting a customer know that we were outside, so I gave dispatch a buzz on my radio and asked them to call the customer back to let them know that I was waiting. Dispatch said no one picked up the phone, but then maybe a second or two later, I saw someone walking out of a house and towards my car. Now, as I said, it was dark, so even though I saw the shape of them moving towards the back passenger door, I didn't get a good look at them until they were sitting behind me, and when I did, I almost pissed my kecks. He was wearing a balaclava, and after he shut the door, he sank down low in the seat to make it harder for him to be seen from the outside. Now, he had what looked like a jerry can of petrol in one gloved hand, and then with the other, he pulled out what looked like an old detective gun from his jacket, like a proper six-shooter, and pointed it directly at me. He said if I tried to run, I'd be shot. In fact, if I did anything that even remotely upset him, I was a dead man. Now, my only job was to do what he said, and when he said it, and if I did, I'd go home alive that night. And so, seeing as I didn't have much of a choice, I drove where he told me to go. We ended up parked up across from a pub not far from the Rialto on Upper Parliament Street, I remember, and the lad in the back told me to turn off the engine and then spent the next 15 minutes or so checking his watch and peering up over the solid part of the door to watch the pub through the window. He kept on checking his watch, and I kept getting the urge to try and talk him out of whatever he was about to do. But every time the words were about to come out, something stopped them. I stayed quiet, and then noticed that when the clock on my dash hit 11 p.m., the lad in the back started getting even twitchier. When I noticed people coming out of the pub, obviously around kick-out time, the lad told me to start the engine. He was watching the pub doors like a hawk, and then suddenly, he started rolling down the window all frantically before he pointed the gun out the window, shouted something I couldn't make out, and pulled the trigger. One of the fellas who just walked out of the pub hit the concrete like a wet sack of spuds. Someone screamed, and then the guy in the back seat let out a scream of his own as he told me to drive. I obviously had to stay under the speed limit where possible, but it was tough with a gun pressed in the back of my head every so often, with its owner telling me that if I stopped for the police or took us down any dead ends, I'd be getting one to the back of the dome. The lad directed me to drive all the way out towards Speke to some of the derelict land near where the airport is today. He told me to get out of the car and then started emptying that can of petrol all over the seats after joining me outside. And that was the closest I had got to trying to do something when I realized that I was about to lose my car. I know that probably sounds horrible, seeing as I didn't do anything about him shooting that fella outside the pub, but I wasn't really in any position to do anything back then. Whereas watching him pour that gasoline with his back to me, I knew that there was a very slim chance that I'd be able to get the drop on him. But if I didn't, I was a dead man. And so I basically talked myself out of it in my head and then watched as he set my car on fire and then ran off into the darkness. I just remember feeling numb. Less than an hour before, I hadn't even received the job yet, and then just a short while after parking outside that house to pick them up, my life had been changed forever. We obviously didn't have any phones back then, so I couldn't just call the police with a mobile like I would now. I had to walk all the way to a payphone, which took quite a while before I could contact the police, and only then could I give them any details. All I wanted to do was go home, get in the bath, and crack open one of the beers that I had waiting for me in the fridge. But the police wanted me to wait where I was so I could guide them to where my car had been dumped. It honestly didn't take all that long, and I'm grateful the police got out to me so fast, but the last thing in the world I wanted to do was go back to where my car was still smoldering and repeat my story for a second time. But I had to, because the most important thing was making it really bloody clear that my part in the murder was an unwilling one, and I did that by giving them as much info as possible on the man that had done the shooting. But when they asked if I'd be willing to appear in a court at a later date, I told them no. Call me a coward, but to me, you'd have to be mental to testify against some gangster in this city. Maybe if I was in London or New York or somewhere like that, but not Liverpool, because everyone knows everyone round here. And they said that I might get asked again if murder detectives were put on the case and they found someone they wanted to charge. But the fact that I never got that call is the only proof that I need that they didn't catch anyone. I used to have nightmares about it too, proper horrible ones as well. But nowadays I just have these dreams, not quite nightmares but still clear enough for me to remember when I wake up in the morning. And sometimes in those dreams I do what I wanted to do in the moment and beg the killer to reconsider. But no matter what I say and no matter how I say it, he never, ever listens. Hey friends, thanks for listening. Click that notification bell to be alerted of all future narrations. I release new videos every Monday and Thursday at 9 p.m. Eastern Time, and there are super fun live streams on Sundays and Wednesday nights. If you got a story, be sure to submit them over at my email at letsreadsubmissions@gmail.com, and you might even hear your own story featured on the next video. And if you want to support me even more, grab early access to all future narrations and bonus content over on Patreon, or click that big join button to hear about the extra perks for members of the channel. And check out the Let's Read podcast, where you can hear all of these stories and big compilations located anywhere you listen to podcasts. I also have a true crime channel called Saturn Soul. All links in the description below. Thanks so much, friends. And remember, the beacons are lit. Gondor calls for aids.